David, what was your first connection to doing fire research? Like, where did you start being anything related to fire research?
Yeah, okay. Well, that's a good place to start, really, because it touches on some of the questions that you've raised with me.
Yeah.
So basically, I started to work as an inhalation toxicologist in the early 1970s, about 1974. And not long after I'd started this work, we were approached by Professor Woolley from the UK Fire Research Station, and it was about the concern to do with the fire statistics and fire deaths in the UK.
Yeah.
And basically, they had a statistics unit there, and we're very lucky in the UK in that we've kept quite detailed fire statistics since World War II. So what happened was that during World War II, all the fire services were nationalised under the Home Office, which is sort of like the Ministry of the Interior. So there was a national system. And when the war finished, they returned all the fire brigades to the local control, but they kept the overall global inspectorate. And one of its tasks was to collect statistics. And there was a particular concern because when they looked at the statistics between the 1950s to the early 70s, that's when smoke toxicity became a real headline issue. Because over that period of time, between about 1955 and 72, there was a fourfold increase in the number of people dying and becoming injured by smoke in fires. And if you look at the statistics around 1955, there were hardly any smoke deaths. I think it was running at about 100 people per million population for smoke, and a similar number or more for burns. Most people were dying from burns in fires. But over the next years, smoke deaths went up to about 1,000 a year. They went up by a factor of 4, whereas the burn deaths stayed more or less constant. So there was a big concern about toxicity. Was there something uniquely, newly toxic going on in fires? Why was this happening? And that's why I was approached to start doing research on this in the sort of early mid-70s. I started looking at toxicity issues and doing experimental work.
So what was the assumptions when you started about this? So there was there's something toxic about smoke. That was the assumption.
Yeah. There always has been, of course. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think points it is that I was fortunate to be able to speak to some firefighters at that time who are coming to the end of their careers. So they've been firefighters throughout this period of change, you know? And I was very struck by what one of them said to me. He said, in the sort of late 50s, if we went to fight a fire in a domestic house, and of course most fire injuries and deaths occur in domestic dwellings, he said, what we would do is we'd open the door, we'd run in, we'd open all the doors and windows, we'd ventilate the property, the smoke would clear, we'd grab the occupants, we'd pull them out, we'd sit them on the curb and bash them on the back a couple of times and they'd be okay. You know? Yeah. Of course, people were tougher in those days, but that was what he said. And he said now, and this was in the sort of mid-70s when I was talking to him, he said, now it's completely different. He said, now if we go to a domestic fire, if we open the door and go in the property, we just get a bigger fire and a lot more smoke. And the smoke is really toxic. And if we can get people and grab them and get them outside, they're really sick and we have to take them to hospital. So that was a kind of a very subjective, but I thought quite powerful impression about the way things had changed. And as I say, I was approached about this time by the Fire Research Station and so started to do research on what was actually happening, how toxic were these products, what were the real issues involved.
So where did you start?
Well, so what we started by doing was looking at the well-known common gases that are known in fires, which is carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide, and carbon dioxide, things like that. And then we also started to do some experiments with various materials. So we looked at common materials like wood, cellulosic materials, and polyurethanes and things, which of course were the thing that people were most concerned about at that time. And the sort of picture that came out of this was two things. One was I realized that it wasn't what kills you in a fire so much that's important, because all fires will kill you if you stay in them long enough. What was really important was what stopped you from getting out alive, what stopped you from escaping without being overcome and collapsing in the fire. And when you look at that, there were a couple of issues, really. One was the asphyxiant gases like carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide. And of course, what happens with them is you inhale them and you build up a dose over a period of time. And when that dose gets to a critical level, then you collapse and become unconscious. And once you're unconscious, of course, you just continue to breathe until you die unless somebody pulls you out quickly. So these asphyxiant gases...
And that is regardless of the amount of oxygen available.
Right. Well, what turned out of this was there's a really simple, fortunately, a very simple set of asphyxiant gases in fires that are important. So the most important probably is carbon monoxide. It's in all fires because all fires just about involve burning carbon-containing fuels. The carbon monoxide, very important. Any fuel that contains nitrogen, like urethane foams and various types of cladding materials and things like that, and if they have nitrogen, then they'll produce hydrogen cyanide, which contributes. And we treat those as more or less additive. So the dose of CO plus the dose of cyanide add up together to give you the overall effect. Carbon dioxide, which is always also present, is important because it makes you breathe faster. And if you breathe faster, you take up the other toxic gases more quickly. And then, yes, of course, as the fire burns, it starts to use up the oxygen in the environment. And all these asphyxiant gases are working by causing a kind of hypoxia. So oxygen depletion also comes into the mix. But what we find in practice is that the way fires burn and the chemistry changes during combustion is that the yields and amount concentrations of carbon monoxide and cyanide are going to get you and knock you down in nearly every case before the oxygen drops significantly. So although oxygen is a factor that I do include in my calculations, it's a sort of secondary issue. It's this CO and the cyanide that knock you down. So those are the asphyxiant gases, right? And they've always been present. They're not new, but we would say that a part of the change that occurred in the statistics relates to the amounts of those that are being produced and the yields at which they're being produced. So it's the same gases, but it's a problem in the way they're formed. The next thing that's very important is irritant acid gases and organic irritants in the smoke. So one of the things that happens when you burn things, particularly burn things inefficiently, is that some of the carbon compounds come off as aldehydes and ketones, things like formaldehyde or choline. These sting the eyes and hurt your breathing and make it difficult to breathe when you're exposed to them. And of course, they're going to impair people's willingness and ability to escape through smoke. If you try to go into some smoke and it stings your eyes and you can't breathe, you're more likely to turn back and fail to be able to escape. So these irritant gases are very important. Also, at the time of the fire, so they're going to impair your ability to get out. But they also can get into the lung and cause lung damage. Inhalation injury usually develops a couple of hours afterwards. If you survive the immediate fire, it's a problem when you get to hospital. So these are the irritants. And the irritants are partly organic things like formaldehyde, but they're also acid gases. And the most common one that you get in fires is hydrogen chloride, which is given off by things like PVC, which is an acid gas. So all these things can affect you at the time by impairing your ability to escape and breathe, and then affecting you later by possibly damaging your lungs. And then there's a third category of toxicants, which are the sort of environmental toxicants. So these are things that are present at very low concentrations. They don't have any effect on you at the time. They don't really affect you immediately after the fire, but they can contaminate the environment. Some of them are carcinogens, particularly a hazard for firefighters, which we can talk about in a minute if you like. And So we need to think about those. So these are the three categories of toxicants that we need to consider about what's there and what's changed over the years.
Yeah, I would love to get to the long-term damaging, also the environmental category, but I want to really start with the acute ones.
Yeah, sure.
So when I became a firefighter, I was taught basically about CO being the most important one, and I know that I was taught that it was a problem in hydrogen cyanide because it left the body so soon after you were exposed. So on toxicology reports, the hydrogen cyanide was very low. It was sort of gone. But the theory was, I was told, was that hydrogen cyanide was a big part of that mix, but it left the body really fast.
Yeah, there's a big problem because we're kind of lucky with CO, because CO combines with hemoglobin in the blood to make carboxyhemoglobin, and that's a very stable compound. So with carbon monoxide, if you imagine you're walking down, say, a tunnel with a certain concentration, say 1% carbon monoxide in the smoke, then after you've walked for about 3 minutes, as you walk, you'll be continuously taking up carbon monoxide into your blood in the form of carboxyhemoglobin in a linear way, as long as you walk along. And when that dose in your blood reaches about 30% carboxyhemoglobin, then you will feel dizzy and you collapse. And then once you've collapsed, you continue to breathe much more slowly now until eventually you die, probably at about 50 to 60% carboxyhemoglobin, or perhaps a bit higher. And then if you were exposed to, well, I said 1%, which is 10,000 ppm, right? Yeah. That gives you about 3 minutes. If you're exposed to half that concentration, 5,000 ppm or 0.5%, then you can walk for about twice as far. So it's a kind of proportional thing. Yeah. And one way of, for an engineering point of view, to look at the dose is to express it in ppm minutes. Okay, so for somebody walking along, you can inhale about 35,000 ppm minutes before you've inhaled a dose which will give you a carboxyhemoglobin causing collapse, about 35,000. Okay. Now, if we and then once you've collapsed, that carbon monoxide, carboxyhemoglobin stays in your blood. So if the person dies and you recover the body, and the body hasn't been really badly completely burned, then you should be able to get enough of a sample to measure the carboxyhemoglobin that was in their blood at the time of death.
Yeah.
And so we have a very good data sets for this. And what we find is that people who've died from smoke exposure and not from burns will all have pretty well more than 40% carboxyhemoglobin. And the kind of mean level is about 75% in a body of a person who's died from carbon monoxide poisoning in a fire. Okay?
And that would be standard procedure to measure anyone at a fire who dies.
That's right, and that's routinely done by the pathologist after the event. If somebody collapses in a fire and then is rescued alive, then as they breathe air, or especially if they're given oxygen to breathe, which they normally would be by the emergency services, then gradually the carbon monoxide is washed out of the blood with an exponential curve with time, right? So typically what would happen is they'd get in the ambulance, they'd be given oxygen, they'd start to wash out the carbon monoxide from their blood. And then when they get to hospital, a blood sample will be taken and you get a measurement of the carboxyhemoglobin in the survivor's blood. Yeah. And that's going to be quite a bit lower than it was at the time they were rescued from the fire.
Yeah.
But if I know the time when the blood sample was taken compared to the time they were taken out of the fire, then I can back calculate up that curve to calculate what they were at the time they were rescued.
Yeah.
And that's a very useful tool. I've done that quite a lot in the investigations. So great stuff. Carbon monoxide, it tells us a lot. And of course, it is the main cause of death, certainly. And it's always present in fires, as we discussed. Now, comparing that with cyanide, it's rather different. Now, both of these gases cause death by hypoxia, by stopping the body tissues getting enough oxygen, but by different mechanisms. So with carbon monoxide, the main toxicity actually occurs because it combines with the blood. So most of the carbon monoxide stays in the blood as carboxyhemoglobin. So it means there's less hemoglobin to carry oxygen in your blood. And also a very nasty added thing is that what oxygen is carried in the blood, or the other 50% or so of non-affected hemoglobin, it can't be released into the tissues. Right, so it's a double whammy effect. And the end result is that your tissues, particularly your heart and your brain, become starved of oxygen. And that's why you collapse from carbon monoxide. Now, with cyanide, the active site is in the cells themselves of your brain and your muscles, or your heart especially. And what cyanide does is it doesn't stop the oxygen getting to your cells, but it stops it being used once it gets there. It poisons the cellular metabolism, right? But the end result is roughly the same in terms of why you collapse. But the big thing about cyanide is that if you are walking down a corridor breathing, say, 100 ppm cyanide, that's enough to cause you problems. So that's the first thing is cyanide is about 20 to 40 times as toxic, more potent than carbon monoxide. You need much less of it, right? Yeah. The other thing is when you inhale cyanide, it stimulates breathing. And so, in fact, if you breathe about 150 ppm of cyanide, it can cause your breathing over a period of a minute to increase by a factor of about 3.
Oh, wow.
And so that increases as your breathing goes up, you start to breathe in more and more of the stuff, right? Yeah. So the rate of uptake of the cyanide gets quicker and quicker and quicker, greater and greater. And you get a kind of a pulse, a sort of a peak of cyanide in the blood.
Yeah.
And that gets to the brain and the heart. And once it gets to a certain level, then you collapse, right? So now you've collapsed and you're on the floor. Now because you're unconscious, you don't breathe as much at all. Your breathing drops right down.
Yeah.
And so the rate of uptake of cyanide then decreases, and you can actually come around again. So you've collapsed, gone unconscious, then you can wake up.
Okay.
And then if the exposure continues, you go into a slow sort of decline, and eventually you'll stop breathing and die.
Yeah.
If you're breathing something like 1,000 ppm of cyanide, then after a few breaths, you could just stop breathing. It stops you breathing, you collapse, and you can die. So with cyanide, it's the rate of uptake that's very important. And just to make this clear, if you breathe about 100 ppm of cyanide, which is not too bad, then you'd have about 25 minutes before this would kick in and you'd collapse. So that the increase in breathing is more gentle and the uptake is more gentle. And so you can keep going for longer. So that's 100 ppm, right? Yeah. If you inhale 200 ppm, twice as much, then your tolerance time goes down from 30 minutes, not to 15 minutes, but to 2 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Right? Yeah. Because of this effect that I've just described. So cyanide and typical concentrations of cyanide in domestic furniture fires and things might be somewhere in the region of a few hundred to up to 1,000 ppm.
Yeah.
So that's why I feel that cyanide in these kind of fires is a very important kind of knockdown. It is going to cause people to collapse very quickly and stop them escaping. But it's then somewhat self-limiting, so it's less likely to be the ultimate cause of death because CO is always present as well, and usually a lot of it. And so what actually kills you in the end is probably going to be the carbon monoxide, but the cyanide might cause an early knockdown, right? Now, one of the things that you asked me earlier was you were saying that we find CO in the bodies of people who are fire victims. We don't hear much about cyanide. And there are several reasons for this. Now, one of the reasons is that it's often not measured. People don't look for it. Another reason is that it's very unstable in blood. So if you have a stored blood sample with carbon monoxide in, it stays for years or even months, certainly. You've got plenty of time. But with cyanide in a blood sample, it decreases by about 50% for each day before you take the sample from the, if it's a fatality, before the, if you wait a day before you take the blood from the cadaver, then you've lost half the cyanide. It goes down very quickly. Yeah. And even if you store it in a refrigerator, it gradually goes away. But the other very important reason is to do with this dynamics that I've just mentioned. So what happens with cyanide is that, a little bit like carbon monoxide, it does to some extent combine with the red blood cells. Because in the red blood cells, there's a small amount of a type of hemoglobin called methemoglobin. And methemoglobin reacts with cyanide to form something called cyanomethemoglobin. But far from being toxic, that actually detoxifies the cyanide. It mops it up. And it's that, and making using nitrate to make methemoglobin in a fire survivor is sometimes used as a cyanide antidote. Yeah. So you artificially increase the methemoglobin in their blood, and it mops up any cyanide, right? So a proportion of the cyanide is in the whole blood, but a proportion of it is in the blood plasma and in solution, and that cyanide distributes throughout the whole of the body water. So whereas carbon monoxide mostly stays in the blood as carboxyhemoglobin, a lot of cyanide flows out into all the body water, so the extracellular body water and the intracellular water. So if you've got about a few hundred mils of blood in your body, if you've got for example, per liter of blood in your body, you might have about 4 or 5 liters of extracellular water, and you might have another 5 or 6, 10 liters of intracellular water. So there's a lot more space for that cyanide to go. So the picture I'm painting is, you're in a fire, you breathe cyanide for a few minutes, it goes up very rapidly and you get very high blood levels temporarily. It knocks you down, you're on the floor, and then that cyanide then disperses throughout the body. And then eventually somebody takes a sample, maybe hours later, by which time it doesn't really show up anymore. Yeah. But at the time you were exposed, it could have had a very big effect. Yeah. And so that's part of the problem. We do find in pathology studies that there is where you get high CO, you often do get also quite a bit of cyanide in the blood. So it is a marker, but it's a much more complicated thing to interpret. Yeah. And the fact that I think one point I would like to get over is, if you have a situation where somebody has cyanide in their blood, a significant level, about up to 3 micrograms per mil, then that's a sign that they had quite a severe exposure to cyanide in the fire. But if you don't find that, if you don't find any or very little cyanide, it doesn't mean that they might have had a brief critical exposure at a certain time that affected their survival at the scene. So it's more complicated to interpret.
Does it? So because you mentioned it's like those cyano kits that the ambulance is, at least in Sweden, at least used to carry. I'm not sure they do it to full extent.
I mean, sometimes it's given as a precaution, and up to a point that's okay. But it's quite a complicated. I mean, I generally feel that it's unlikely that most people are going to die as a result of cyanide in a fire. Yeah. Although they are like to be made unconscious and then die because they're unconscious, rather than that it would actually. And there is a very nice study that was done by Dr. Bode in the Paris Fire Brigade, right? Yeah. And he managed to work with the fire service in Paris in a study where they went to the actual fire scenes, and when people were grabbed and pulled out of a fire at the fire scene, he managed to get a blood sample. He's the only person I know who's managed to do this, right? Okay. And when they analysed the blood, from very fresh blood from victims in these Paris fires, they indeed found both high levels of CO and high cyanides in domestic fire situations. So it shows that it's there, Also in some aircraft fire accidents, we found quite a lot of cyanide. After the Manchester Air Tours fire, there was a lot of cyanide in the blood of those victims. So it's definitely there.
So if you pull some out, do you think it makes sense? If you pull some out of the fire, do you think it still makes sense to give them those cyano kits for the ambulances?
In ambulances?
It would be 20 minutes after a fire if they're still alive,
I think it's a bit of a tough call. I mean, oxygen also helps.
Yeah.
So definitely give oxygen. It's not I don't think there's a clear-cut case about whether she routinely certainly give those cyan kits.
I mean, I know it's a discussion in the medical service in Sweden, because the cost of carrying them on the ambulances was very high. Because I don't know if there's a difference today, but that just a couple of years ago, because you put them on the ambulance and they only can last. They have a shelf life that's fairly low, so you have to keep replacing them all the time, even if you're not using them, which adds up costs. So I don't know if I knew that.
I think it's something that needs thinking about a little bit more carefully, really.
Yeah.
Where it's going to be beneficial.
Yeah, I know that some regions in Sweden were not carrying it on the ambulances. Some did, and I don't know what the right answer was. I'm just curious about the reasons why. But now I think I understand a little bit. The diluting, the dispersing thing makes a lot of sense. That in that case, it's not as harmful as it was acutely in the fire either. Because, again, it's dispersed throughout the body. 20 minutes later or 30 minutes later.
And of course, it's also destroyed. Also, if you survive, it's broken down by the liver after a period of time. So there's a certain half-life where you also exhale it, as you do with carbon monoxide. So I would generally say that I think it's very important at the fire scene, whether you walk out or whether you collapse at the scene, if you survive at the scene and you're given oxygen, a routine sort of treatment, very important for CO, that will also help, and you probably don't need to do anything else. There's a big difference between inhaling cyanide or low concentration cyanide and taking oral cyanide, which is obviously, then you really do need to use an antidote, if you want to try to save somebody. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense.
And then I just wonder, the other thing, of course, is then when we look at different burning fuels, then the guide I would give is, if your fuel contains 1% nitrogen or less, then cyanide is not going to be a problem in that smoke plume. It's going to be CO. Yeah. So if you've got a wood fire, which is 0.1% nitrogen in wood, then there's going to be no cyanide in there. If you've got something like upholstered furniture, which might have 10% nitrogen in the fuel, then cyanide's going to be a significant problem in those fires.
Would you see any difference on the smoke, or you just have to know it? Would you visually be able to recognize that smoke is more dangerous than this smoke?
Well, as we were thinking, there is a bit of a rule of thumb, in that if you've got sort of light grey, woody type smoke, then it's more likely to be mostly CO and a few other things in there, and a bit of smoke particulates. It's when you can see those rich, black, oily, kind of polymery type smokes, then you suspect there might be more toxicity in there. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it, in a general way? But you won't really know whether it's got a nitrogen in the fuel or not unless you know. I mean, if you go to somewhere like a factory which has got those rigid panels, those foam panels, if they're polystyrene, they make a lot of smoke, but there's no CO. So you get a lot of oily smoke with polystyrene fires, but there's only CO in that and other nasty chemicals, but no nitrogen in it. If, on the other hand, you've got an isocyanurate type foam, PIR type foam, then you've got to get a lot of cyanide in there, or you can do. So it depends a bit on what it really depends on the nature of the fuel that's burning, the fuel package that's burning. Yeah.
So when you looked at from the 50s, 70s and onward, do you think the increase in CO, or was it more the increase in hydrogen cyanide, do you think, that made the biggest difference?
Yeah, so just going back to that, I think the statistical stuff is quite interesting. So I think the sort of story is that I mean, I'm going back a long way now, so it's nearly 70 years. So just post-war, if you think of the typical furnishings in a home, it was mostly cellulose. We didn't have a lot of furniture because we couldn't afford it in those days.
Yeah.
And most of the furniture was cellulosic, wood-based stuff. If you had a sofa, it would have metal springs in it, maybe some horsehair, and the covers would be cotton or wool. Yeah. And you wouldn't have any foams or anything like that because that wasn't invented.
Yeah.
And the typical features of those kinds of materials when they're involved in fires, I'm generalizing obviously, is that yes, they can be ignited. Yes, you can get a fire in your domestic home, but the fire growth rate is slow. And it takes a long time for you to get underventilated combustion conditions, which is where you get much higher yields of these products. So generally speaking, cellulose materials, same as they've always been, give off CO. The traditional bedding and furniture. Now, wool does produce cyanide when it burns, but wool is a sort of almost naturally fire-retarded material. It's quite hard to get a rapidly growing fire in a wool carpet or a wool-covered material. So the fires in those days were producing the same CO and the same cyanide, but a lot less of it and a lot less quickly. So the old fires had a low hazard because you had time to react and get out the building while your slowly growing fire grew. Whereas the big change was when we introduced these modern materials, modern in inverted commas, because I'm talking about the mid-60s, then what we got was they're very easy to ignite. And the polypropylene covers and things that we had and various other materials would ignite and burn up very, very quickly. And in the experiments we did with that kind of armchair, we found we'd get a very big fire within a couple of minutes. And it's a bit like I was saying that the firefighters were telling me that you're getting these rapid fires, high yields, appreciation in the environment, lots and lots of smoke, large, high concentrations of both CO and cyanide and dense smoke. All these nasties were being produced much more quickly. So then, of course, we got worried about this in the late 70s, and we introduced the furniture regulations in the late 80s. And the way around it was, having created this problem by having these rapidly burning materials, instead of getting rid of the materials, we started to introduce fire retardant treatments to control the way they burned. And that's where a lot more, if you like, exotic chemicals came into the mix. Mm-hmm. And if you look at this fire statistics, it's very interesting because it did work, right? Because from the mid-80s, we got a big decline in fire deaths and injuries. Now, the advantage of putting fire retardants in is, one, that they reduce the probability that a small ignition source will start a bad fire in the first place, so you get fewer fires, right? Yeah. And secondly, they inhibit fire growth and combustion, so you get a slower fire growth curve and therefore fewer products over a longer period of time. So if you like, you get the dynamic fire performance comes back a bit to what it was before we introduced these problematic materials. So you buy people time to escape from the fire. Now, almost by coincidence, at that same time in history, became a big uptake in the use of domestic smoke detectors. Everybody started to have them within about 3 or 4 years. It was up to 90 and 100%, 90-something percent of homes had battery smoke detectors. And really, the combination of the improved combustion performance plus the early detection with a smoke detector gave us a win-win situation. And I think that's why we got this big improvement in survival rates. But when people did get stuck in these fires, then they could be very toxic.
So a slower fire, but eventually when the fire started really going, it was probably more toxic than it was
as
before.
Bad,
at least
probably worse. As bad. And certainly had got high yields of asphyxiants, which you get in most fires, but also all these nasty irritant chemicals and things, And
a lot of probably environmental long-term problems too.
That's right. And this has become a big issue now because people are saying, well, we shouldn't be using fire retardants. And people have criticized me for saying that we should we must keep our performance, the combustion performance of our furniture down. We must control that. But I don't say you need to control it with flame retardants. You need to control it by whatever method is appropriate.
Yeah.
One method could be to go back to wood and wool, you know.
Yeah.
Another method could be, though, to have the flame retardants there's a huge, very exotic range of chemicals used for flame retardants. And there's a big move to have what we call greener, more environmentally flame retardant chemicals, and there are ways around that, but it's a very complex area and quite controversial.
Yeah, a lot of the green ones are very environmentally friendly until they start to burn.
Exactly. So it's a complicated area.
Yeah,
but the bottom line is, what we don't want is easy of ignition and rapidly growing fires. That's what we don't want above all, right?
So no bookshelves to people. Yeah. We don't.
Well, bookshelves are okay because that's probably fairly slow.
Yeah, actually it is. When I do acquired structure burns, you have stacks of papers. They don't burn well if they're stacked.
Yeah, right.
So if we before we move on more to recent times, we'll go back in time. So I have a beard, and back in the day, firefighters had a beard and put it in their mouth. I would presume, and hear from stories and read about it, they perceived to get rid of some of the irritants in the smoke.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, right. So if you think about the asphyxiant gases are gases, so you can't really filter them as such. I'll expand upon that in a minute. Yeah. But basically, the big problem from a lung damage point of view is the irritant particulates in smoke, right? And the acid gases and the organic irritants and other chemicals. Now, these chemicals can be in vapor or gas form. They can be in liquid droplet form. And the particle size is very important. If you inhale something of a particle that's 100 microns or bigger, right? Then it might get into your mouth, but it won't go any further. Once you get down to about 10 or 15 microns, it will get down into your airways. And once you get down to about 1 or 2 microns diameter, very fine particulates, PM2.5, which is you hear about a lot in the news, that gets right down to the deep lung, into the alveolar area, and it damages your deep lung. So you want to avoid inhaling that. And a simple face mask, ordinary disposable face mask, is really quite effective at trapping those particulates. And the better the mask, the better the protection. Also, these irritant chemicals, a lot of them stick to the particles. So even though some of them are in the vapor form, just by having a particulate filter, you can reduce that. So recent fires that I've got involved in, where ordinary occupants have escaped, they've travelled through dense smoke, where they put wet towels and things over their faces before they left. They reported it was a big help. Now, if you've got a wet damp towel or a damp beard, maybe, then that helps to absorb the acid gases. Hydrogen cyanide is an acid gas. And so you might be able to reduce that somewhat, but mainly you will reduce things like hydrogen chloride, which is a high level, hydrogen bromide, which are highly irritant acid gases. They are easily dissolved in water. So if you have a wet filter or some sort, then there's definitely a help. Yeah.
So because it's been ridiculed in a lot of times. I remember when I was a firefighter, they show videos from Hollywood of people putting rags over or blankets over themselves, and I was going, well, it's a filter, like you said. It is a filter. Maybe it's a bad one, but it's better than nothing.
Better than nothing. Yeah.
And if you wet it, it should dissolve something. Better than nothing.
Absolutely. And I think that does pan out with what people say. Yeah. I mean, a beard, of course, is an issue with mask fitting and stuff like that, if you can get more professional about it. But I don't know whether beard would be all that effective, but you never know. It might help a bit.
I mean, anecdotally, at least firefighters were using it, really back in the day, maybe 50s, because they obviously, someone has felt that it felt better, at least. Now, feeling better
Well, actually, that's not silly, because these irritant chemicals are immediately painful to your nose and eyes and mouth. So you'd detect the difference straight away. Yeah.
But also anecdotally, firefighters realize at some point that even if I power myself over the discomfort of the irritants. At some point, firefighter was started to become unconscious in an alarming rate in fires going forward. So, and
Right.
I understand from reading old magazines that they understood what CO did, but they didn't realize it was such a concern, because back in the day, in their times, you know, the 70s firefighters looking back at the 50s and their teachers, they said basically you just have to power through the pain of irritants, you know, eyes rinning, coughing, snoring, you know, just power through it, and, you know, it's not a problem.
It was a kind of a question of pride in those days. And they used to call themselves smoke heaters in our country. And they took a bit of a pride in that. But then, of course, more recently, we've understood the hazard of those, both during and afterwards, your health, threats to your health from that sort of thing. I mean, I've been working a lot recently on the relationship between smoke and toxic gases as an assessment tool. The way of coming at it, because modeling the entirety of fire is very complex. And I can give you a couple of rules of thumb here, which I've developed by looking at the yields of smoke and toxic gases from a whole range of materials. Now, the thing is, once you burn something, you get a certain yield of smoke and you get a certain yield of CO, right? Yeah. And that gives you a certain concentration of smoke and a certain concentration of CO in your fire. And as the smoke moves away from the fire and becomes diluted with air, the smoke becomes more dilute and you can see further, but in proportion, the CO is also decreasing, right? Because it's dilution. So there's a constant ratio, more or less, between the two. So giving you a sort of rule of thumb, if you can see 10 meters through your smoke from any fire that I can think of, you would be able to walk through that smoke and breathe it for at least an hour or so without suffering any significant effects. Certainly not
acutely.
any CO.
Yeah,
right?
Acutely.
Yeah. Then as you increase the smoke, decrease the visibility by increasing the smoke density, right? If you can see about 4 meters, 3 to 4 meters, then you're on the threshold. You can breathe that for maybe an hour, less half an hour to an hour. And around 3 or 4 meters is quite a critical visibility distance, because it's the distance at which most ordinary occupants will turn back rather than go through smoke. If they're confronted with smoke about 3 or 4 meters visibility, a high proportion will not be able to walk through it. Some will, but some won't. And if they do walk through it, then they should be able to walk through, as long as the density doesn't change, obviously. Yeah. If that's the average density, the thickness of smoke they're going through, they can go for about 3/4 of an hour or so, half an hour.
Oh, wow.
And even at a 1 meter visibility, which is really dense smoke, you've got about 12 or 15, 20 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Before the asphyxiant gases, which is the CO and cyanide, are going to knock you down. So I think that gives you a kind of rule of thumb to look at a smoke scenario and say, well, how bad is that smoke going to be, you know?
Because I heard you say that. I listened to another podcast. I was like, instantly, that's such a great thing you hear. Because when I was doing public education, of course, you teach them about fire, but fire is very intuitively. Like you will sense how close can I get to the flame? Well, you just feel it. Like it's not a problem that someone will go maybe too close with a fire extinguisher, because they will feel it. That's very intuitively. Right. But the smoke is always an issue, and then we teach the public that smoke is dangerous. Of course, we should teach people that smoke is dangerous, but it is also like, okay, so when do I have a chance to do sort of like an attempt to extinguish or to get out? And that was the first time I heard a scientist had the guts to say something that was generic. Like, because scientists are understandably very reserved, is saying, in this specific we've measured at this specific point here, we can say that at that point, at that fire, with these fuels, this was a concentration, and they should be able to survive in that point. But generally, we can say anything because we don't want to we don't want to lose our jobs.
Yeah.
So when you started having that conversation, I think it was excellent saying that, because I would have thought it was much less than that.
Obviously, the caveat depends on the fuel and all those things. But as a sort of as a rule of thumb, we call it, rough concept. I mean, if you are exposed to those sort of, say, 10 meters visibility smoke, and where this comes up as a problem, as a different problem, is when there's a fire in a factory down the road, and you're in your house and it's blowing in your back garden or something, and you inhale that for an hour or so, you may well have a bit of a sore throat or irritable eyes the next day. But we're not talking. I'm really talking about the acute, life-threatening scenario. And what I'm finding, particularly been looking at it, for instance, and I really feel for people in this situation, and I've come across this a number of times. These are occupants in domestic fires. Is that you're in say in your bedroom, and there's a fire downstairs in the lounge downstairs. The smoke's coming up the stairs. You open the bedroom door. You see the hallway and landing is full of smoke. You have to make this decision. Do I stay or do I go? And it's not an easy decision. If you go, you risk something nasty being further down. Then you might not get to the front door. You might collapse on the way down. If you stay, you're okay for a bit, but how long will it be before somebody comes to get me out? And I mean, I've come across tragic situations where some people have said, "Wow, I'm out of here," and they just go for it, and they've got out okay in most cases. But of course, not always. Sometimes they don't. Other cases, people have gone to the situation, they've looked out and said, "Oh, it's bad. I think I'd be safer to stay where I'm. The environment's good where I am. I'm going to defend in, rest in place, stay in place." And they stay behind, and then they're stuck there. And of course, the fire is getting worse and worse and worse. And then repeatedly, maybe they've got their family with them, repeatedly revisiting this situation. Do I stay or do I go? And then the fire gets around maybe to the outside of their room they're in, and then they're in a real difficult situation. So it's a really hard call. It's a tough call to make, but it has a huge influence on people's survival, I think.
Yeah, because I think like one there with is actually, super practical would be when they call 911 or 112 in Europe, and the dispatcher, because basically what they're telling them, if it's smoke in the hallway, don't get out, because they can't quantify how much smoke it is. It's a
hard one to.
But if there is a simple one when they go like, "Can you see 10 meters?" Go for it. Now, of course, there's 3, 4, 5, and how do you judge it? So, but if you can see 10 meters, go. That would be a huge, like a simple guideline for like dispatch centers to give advice over the phone.
Right.
So I think that's a game changer, because I have never heard it anywhere. Anyone willing with any credentials to back it up, saying that we could use that as a guideline. I think that's huge. And I want to send this conversation to a lot of the public prevention people in Sweden.
I mean, we also use this kind of rough guidance with respect to. We can distinguish between domestic spaces and public buildings. And one of the issues is travel distance. And if you're in a domestic dwelling, particularly if it's your own house, you're familiar with the layout. There's short distances involved. Then the idea was you could tolerate higher smoke concentrations and still get through it. Right. Whereas if you're in, say, a theatre or a shopping mall or something like that, and you can't see 10 meters, then you can't, and you're unfamiliar with the place. You don't know where the exits are. The smoke layer may have obscured the signs. And so, from a design perspective, I kind of recommend that, certainly for public buildings or larger spaces, a tenability limit would be 10 meters. If your design fast scenario gives you less than 10 meters visibility before you've calculated the occupants have escaped, then you need to revisit your design.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Like, orientation is not a big issue when you're at home.
Less so, yeah.
Less so. So no, I think that's major. And when you say the next level, like 3 to 4 meters. Now, when you get to that level, the rate of change also is much faster. Like how fast it might.
I'm not addressing rate of change. So obviously, if you're in a dynamic situation and you're more than a minute maybe in that environment, everything could change. Yes. So it depends on the developing scenario. So it's very dangerous to go out into that kind of situation unless you really have to.
Oh yeah, and I don't say you should, but it's important to know that if you that you can, if you have to. Like where I face it more like I do a lot of I only do training of firefighters, and in Sweden we have a lot of first responders that respond without an SCBA, like most countries have, but Sweden has gone really heavily into having smaller vehicles that respond from their home, like fire officers having their a small fire truck. It's just a normal vehicle, but they like actual fire truck. They have it with them home, and they go straight to the fire. While the firefighters go to the fire station and take the big fire truck and come after. So the fire officers usually at scene much faster than the firefighters. If we talk about retained firefighters, which has hugely impacted, of course, the amount of time you save to do that initial response. But you're limited also. You're just one person, and you don't have an SCBA, or if you have an SCBA, it's on the vehicle. You have to get dressed when you get on scene. So the question always is, so what can you do as a single person, as a firefighter? Now, they should, of course, know more, but we've also had this just the duty of care, which is basically also said, like, if there's smoke, you shouldn't go inside because you're a firefighter, but you're still human. But to give them more guidelines saying that you shouldn't take any risks, but if you want to, these are some guidelines. And like,
these are tough issues because they're in an emergency situation. I mean, in principle, I really support what you're saying because my take on all this is that time is so precious.
Yeah.
Fires develop, as you know, exponentially.
Yeah.
So if you can get there within a minute or two, your chances of intervening successfully are hugely improved compared to if you don't get there for 10, 15, 20 minutes. And I almost feel that in many scenarios, it's almost not possible for a regular fire response to actually intervene within the time window that people will have. Depends on the scenario and where the occupants are vis-a-vis the fire. But certainly for example, if a fire's in the enclosure of origin, if a person's in the same room as the fire, you've only got a very, very short window of time to successfully intervene. And if they're in another room, well, if they can isolate themselves, then of course, then they should have a much longer period, providing you can get there within half an hour or 20 minutes and get to them. But then can you get to them? Because it depends on the conditions of developing the, outside their enclosure at the time. Now, what I would say is, from a health perspective, going back to what we were saying earlier, the number one thing from a health perspective is respiratory protection.
Yeah.
And I might get shot for doing this because it's but any protection is better than none. So a reasonable cartridge, for example, or even a surgical mask, but I mean a cartridge mask that you could easily carry around the back of the car and slip on, will protect you. And you can have canisters in there to absorb acid gases.
Yeah.
That will give you a few minutes of protection of your lungs and respiratory system from acid gases and particulates, right? Which are a threat to your post-exposure health. And if you're doing it on a regular basis, then it's a chronic health issue.
Oh, for sure.
So you want to avoid that if you can. And so some kind of simple first level of respiratory protection I think would be a good thing. But of course, it won't protect you from the asphyxiant gases from the CO and stuff if you're going into a dense-ish sort of smoke environment. So it's a judgment call, I'm afraid. But I would always say have some respiratory protection as an absolute minimum that's easily to have with you. I mean, there are other bits of kit that, of course, some will take out asphyxiant gases, or you can have oxygen and stuff. There's all sorts of ranges of these things. But the bottom line is have something to take out the particulates at that very minimum.
Yeah, I've seen, like you said, I've seen the particle masks, or not particle masks, but I've seen disposable masks that absorb CO2, like
something like that would be great. Yeah. But you have to recognise it's a very limited period of time.
Or whatever. Absolutely. It's just when you saturate it, you're done. And you don't know when it's saturated. No. But I'm thinking top of my head here about, like, again, the scenario of firefighter arriving. They don't have a self-contained breathing apparatus. They don't have air with them. They have maybe a particle mask, or at least a time to put on a particle mask of some sort. Now, if you have, and this is a question, if you have some kind of particle mask that at least protect you long term from those health decides, but you have your eyes free, so irritants are working in your eyes, so when if you're going to make a judgment call, let's say there's a fire in a bedroom further down, but it's fairly good in the living space and so on, and you want to make a quick search of that living space on that time, and you make a judgment call, and let me say, is it possible to say that, well, if your eyes is not burning, if you can see more than 5 meters, I can make a 1-minute sweep of that space without any major acute risk? I know that there's this. I know that scientists don't like these questions.
I'm very interested. I'm very interested in putting these questions to me, because I have to say, I mean, my work, I'm mostly thinking about the occupants. Yeah. So I'm thinking they're already there. What are they don't have a
choice. We have a choice. Yeah.
But now you're making me uncomfortable, because you're thinking, I'm now going there and I'm voluntarily. Yeah. Am I going to expose myself to this?
I changed it then. It is your kids.
I understand.
Might be in there. So now it's up to you. You're not going to say, I don't care about the long term. I care about, is this possible or not?
Yeah. Well, it's possible. I mean, as I said, the thing that's going to actually have you on the ground is the asphyxiant, from a toxicity point of view, was the asphyxiant gases. Yeah. And if you can see a few meters, then you aren't likely to have, and you go in there for, say, 2 minutes, you're not going to inhale enough asphyxiant gases to make you unconscious, right? But if you're in a sort of situation where it's a 1 meter visibility or less, you've got a real, I don't think, that's a very, very dangerous. You go in there, you might not come out.
Yeah, I'm not saying you should. I'm just
saying, once you get, so if you can see a few meters, it's a guide that you could conceivably get in and out there within a minute or two without serious effects.
Yeah. And then if we're talking 10 meters, then...
And this is an issue that did come up for me, which is a related issue, is if you, as a firefighter with, say, BA, go into a building and the corridors and escape routes are heavily smoke logged because there's a fire somewhere, and then you've got people who are in closed rooms who are to some extent, what's the word, resting in place, sheltering in place.
Shelter in place, defend in place. Yeah.
Is it safe for you to open that door, go in the room, get this person who's in, it was actually at that moment in a safe-ish space, and then take them out through all that smoke in the escape route? Yeah. Now, that's an issue that came up in a couple of cases that I've been involved in. And I think sort of, again, one of the sort of guidelines is for firefighters is, it's not safe for us to get people out because they'll have to go through this smoke in order to get them out. And that might, and again, even if the smoke is pretty dense, as long as that transit time is of the order of a minute or less, to get them down, say, 20 or 30 meter corridor or something, then the added dose that they're going to get by that transition is going to be relatively small. Yeah. Okay. Once they've been there for 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, then it's really dodgy, But if you're only talking about a few seconds to a minute of transition time, then I mean, if they're in a safe space and they're going to be safe, leave them there.
Yeah.
If the general scenario is becoming threatening, get them out, and they can still tolerate that exposure on the way down. So, I mean, I've been the last 4 years working on the Grenfell Tower fire, and there were cases there, and I've been committed a lot of people who escaped from their flats and came down up to 23 stories through smoke with a visibility of about 0.5 to 1 meter. The dense smoke in the stair.
Yeah.
And it wasn't pleasant, but by the time they got to the bottom, some of them were on the verge of collapse, but every single one walked from the tower who did that.
Oh, wow.
Now, some people died on the way down, but they'd had a previous exposure in their flats.
Yeah.
But the ones who entered the stair in a good condition, pretty well all made it down.
Yeah.
So, and it took them about 12 minutes or so to walk down. So, you can get people out through smoke, even if it's quite dense, as long as you minimize their exposure time. Yeah. Difficult. It's a difficult call.
I got so many questions.
Yeah.
But to start somewhere, I want to first devil's advocate. So we find in the fire service, look at data from different countries where people are found. And anecdotally, we know that we find people a lot of times in the place between their beds or wherever they were and between the door. So the thought process is they've realized there's a fire, they've gone up, they've stood up, tried to find a door, and they collapse. That's not a long distance in a place where they have orientation. How, in that sense, how it is, Paul, if you can go down 23 flights of stairs, 12 minutes.
Yeah. It does depend on the scenario.
Yeah.
And it depends on what the pre-exposure was. And I mean, a lot of the quite common situation, a bit like what you're saying, but slightly different, is where people have been in a bedroom and they're asleep or lying down. And I remember one particular case I looked at was a fire that broke out in, I think it was a lounge, in a living room downstairs in a small terraced house. And it broke out about breakfast time, 8 o'clock in the morning. The adults were downstairs. They survived. The 2 children were upstairs in an upstairs bedroom in bunk beds, one above the other. And they were asleep. And they both inhaled quite a high dose of carbon monoxide. But they collapsed as they tried to get out of bed. And in the other scenario, you see is people, as you say, collapse near the door. And one of the explanations for that is that what determines all this is the amount of oxygen getting to your brain and your body. And when you're exercising, you need a lot more oxygen, because you're metabolizing more. So while you're at rest, you can tolerate a higher dose of carboxyhemoglobin, up to 40-odd% carboxyhemoglobin in the blood. As long as you're at rest and sitting down or lying down, you can be fairly conscious and normal. As soon as you get up and start to move around, the metabolic demands on you and your circulation are such that you immediately become dizzy and collapse. And what I'm finding is, and I'm finding this experimentally as well, is that if it's just carbon monoxide, 30% carboxyhemoglobin is the dose level at which people feel dizzy and collapse. So up to 20 or so percent, 20% carboxyhemoglobin, you get a bad headache and flu-like symptoms. Once you get up to 30, then you go through a sudden phase of sort of intoxication. It's a bit like alcohol intoxication. You feel very woozy, and within seconds you're down. And so if you were breathing, for example, 1% carbon monoxide in the fire, which is quite possible in a domestic fire scenario, then you've only got about 3 minutes before you collapse. So which is very concentration dependent.
Yeah, and of course, and that makes it. You have some pre-exposure before you try to get up. You try to move through the smoke. It's disorienting. It takes longer than you think to get out. Then you get to the front door, and there's a lock, and you should open the lock, and you're fiddling with the lock. You can't really see, and then you're at that point where you.
I mean, I'll give you another example. I mean, this is a Grenfell thing again because I've worked on it so much. Is that I estimated that in this stair that I talked about, that people descended, the carbon monoxide concentration was somewhere around about 1,800 parts per million.
Yeah.
On average. It was probably fluctuating.
Yeah.
And because it was at that, with the visibility, people said they could see the lights on the walls as they came down, you know, and sometimes they could see their feet or they could see the back of the person in front of them. So it wasn't totally invisible.
Yeah.
And so they were able to go for maybe 12, 11 minutes through that one. But from various fire tests and things I've done and the conditions described, in the common big problem in Grenfell was that the common hallways on each floor got very, very heavily smoke logged.
Yeah.
And that's where people said, "Oh, I opened the door and it was so bad I couldn't enter that smoke." But that smoke, I estimate, was between 0.5% and 1% CO. You know, so 10 times more.
Yeah.
And that will knock you down in a couple of minutes. Now there were some people who were in a lift, an elevator. They came down to, I think it's the 10th floor. The doors opened. They came out disorientated into this smoke-filled hallway, and they died within 5 minutes. They collapsed within 5 minutes and died. And that was because I believe that, from various bits of work I've done, that the concentrations they're exposed to were so high that they had a very, very short time, tolerance time. So, I would say if you've got reasonably good visibility, then maybe. But once it gets down to sort of hand in front of your face, very, very hazardous, could be very short. And cyanide is another big problem, because if you're exposed to 100 parts per million cyanide, which is quite often, could easily happen in a fire, then you can tolerate that for about half an hour, 20 minutes to half an hour, right? If you're exposed to 200 ppm, you've got a couple of minutes. So it's not proportional. So cyanide, high concentration, very rapid knockdown.
Yeah.
With carbon monoxide, it's directly proportional. So if you're exposed to 1%, you've got 3 minutes. If you're at 0.5%, you've got 6 minutes. But cyanide is much different,
So if you're standing up directly into the plume with all the heat and everything, the concentration could be way higher than that.
Way higher. And it could almost be one breath.
Yeah.
And this is getting a bit beyond any experimental stuff, but from anecdotes of cases, there have been examples where people would take a breath and then more or less collapse immediately. Now, there are some, if you think of a fire, you talk a bit about fire plumes now. When I do large-scale fire experiments, say with a room corridor rig, so you've got a room with a fire in, and you've got a somewhat ventilation-controlled fire in the room, and then you've got a upper layer plume coming out and flowing down the corridor, right?
Yeah.
And then you look at the gases in that upper layer plume. Below that plume, it's air, normal air. Yeah. There's air coming into the fire. If you're underneath the layer, you're okay. If you put your head into that layer, you can be exposed to 15% carbon dioxide, 5% 5% carbon monoxide, 500 to 1,000 ppm cyanide, and 0 oxygen, as well as the heat.
Yeah.
So you can imagine if you stick your head up into that and took a breath, maybe that would be enough. And I think I read about a case, particularly I'm thinking of a firefighter who went to fight a vehicle fire. As you know, vehicle fires are terrible. The plastics and stuff's in.
Yeah.
And because it was outside, he wasn't wearing any protection, but he kind of opened the door to this car or something, got his head in the smoke, and more or less took a breath and more or less collapsed on the spot. So these thick plumes can be very, very hazardous to inhale.
Oh, it's got so many questions, but I'll try to go back to, because you touched upon the corridor. Back in the day, firefighters didn't have SCBAs. Of course, they were taught to crawl under the smoke. We teach children to crawl under the smoke. We talk about people go under the smoke, of course, and the assumption, of course, is that there is probably a massive difference between the height of the compartment, what the toxic environment and down versus up in the compartment. Is that true just beside the fire? Is it true 50 meters away?
Yeah. So we did quite a lot of experiments along these similar lines. So if you think of a ventilated compartment, so a room with a window opening or a door opening, or as I said, a room corridor. I like room corridor rigs. I think they're a better way of doing things, where you have an open corridor, right? Yeah. So then you've always got pretty well always got layering, because you've got a hot buoyant plume which cools a bit as it goes down the corridor, but it's always buoyant. So you pretty well always get a reasonable separation between the upper and lower layer in the corridor, and even in the room of origin. Not that you'd ever get that far because it'd be so bad, right? The problem arises when there's no vent. And so I was quite interested in this. So we changed our rig. So we had a room, an ISO room, basically, a long corridor. It was about 20 meters long, I think. And then we had so I want another room at the other end. So I was simulating a flat with a fire in a bedroom, and then, or fire in a lounge or something, armchair, fire in a lounge, door open to the hallway. Plume comes down the hallway, goes into the open door of the bedroom. The plume hits the bedroom wall and then trains down, and then you get mixing within the environment. Okay. So as soon as, and then we also then went on to an enclosed house, right? So it's a domestic 2-story house, and we had furniture fires in the downstairs living room, external doors and windows all closed, right? So total volume is about 90 cubic meters of the opening system. Open doorway into the hallway. Smoke goes up the stairs, fills the hallway for 2 stories. And then you've got 2 bedrooms upstairs, one open and one closed. And we monitor the conditions in all these places, right? So what we find is that initially the plume comes out and flows up the stairs. But then it cools and entrains air. And the air supplying the fire is coming from the doorway to the living room. So you get a circulation, and then you get quite a bit of mixing. So you can then get some contamination down to near ground level. But the caveat is, if it's a vented open system, then always you've got good layering. So yes, definitely better down below. And even when you've got mixing, it's going to be worse fire up, So the short answer is yes, get down. Just get down and stay down as much as you can.
So we have the recommendations for the public and kids, and for that matter, firefighters, still hold up that you should probably still be as low as possible.
Yeah. But still try and move if you can, but keep down.
As a firefighter, you have more leeway if you can see it.
And of course, you're reducing your heat. We haven't talked about heating. You're talking about reducing your heat exposure as well.
So on the path, on that level also, when I was taught as firefighter, I wanted to get to the open and closed door also, about leaving them or taking them out.
The backdraft issue.
No. Yeah, we can get to that too. But so when I was taught that if you go into a fire compartment or a fire building and the fire compartment is being something, you find a person, you should of course drag them out. And I was taught that you should, the classic, you should take your arms, pick them up in your arms, and you lift them up and you stand up and drag them out. That was how you were taught to took them out. But you're lifting the person up as high as you can, because that's the fastest way for you to go out if you have some sense of where you're going.
Yeah.
But the downside of that, of course, is that we're taking a person that was fairly low down into the compartment and taking them up. So I have 2 questions. But one, if they're not breathing and it's not very hot, it shouldn't make much of a difference. But we don't know if they're breathing. That's my first thought. But if they're breathing, we're making it maybe potentially much worse, rather than I started seeing a lot of the Americans when I started interested in that they generally take, some call it the dirty drag. They take the feet instead. Sure, their head will bounce in the ground, but they take their feet and put them on their arm or drag them standing up or crouching down so the head stays down all the time. It's one, it keeps their airways low, and two, it's much easier to drag them because it's easier to control the legs instead of slipping out rather than arms, because arms are terrible at staying in place. Does it make sense, or do you think it's an over-exaggerated risk of keeping the airway high in that?
God, you are raising very interesting points here I've never addressed before. I mean, I quite like the idea of the dragging, keeping down, and of course it's partly whatever works and getting out as quick as you can.
Yes,
but I would say that what do you have much sense of what the environment was higher up? Because you're wearing BA and everything. No.
It's just black and dirty, and it's very hard to know.
Can't you feel the heat on your ears?
No, not anymore.
No.
You're too insulated. So you don't really know how hot it is. I mean, you have a sense how hot it is, and you have a thermal imager. So you know that if it's hot or not, but you don't know how hot. You don't know, of course, how poison is, unless you can establish that 3-4 meter.
Well,
as a benchmark.
Coming back to what I said earlier, I think from a toxicity point of view, and if they're unconscious, they're not breathing much anyway. You know, their respiration. So the exposure should be a very short exposure time while you're dragging them out.
If you're fast, but it takes way longer than most people think to get people out. It's not 30 seconds. That's an anomaly. I would say 2 minutes, 5 minutes it could take for a residential space, and that's if they're normal size. Some people today are way above normal size.
Well, that's tricky, isn't it? I mean, obviously it depends on the conditions, but I mean, the priority is to get them out. But
there's a lot of people saying says, whatever way works is the best.
I'm kind of sympathetic to that sort of
with the details
approach, but obviously, yes, you don't. I mean, I think if the higher they are up in the vertically, the worse it's going to be whatever they're exposed to. So if you can keep them down low, it's better. But I wouldn't say don't do it.
I've had this thought before, and it ties into when I heard your talk about the visual distance. If you can see your feet as a firefighter, if you can sort of have a good sense of where you are, you can stand up and drag them, because the chance of you falling down because of debris is fairly low. Like it's very unpractical if you can't see where you are. It's very unpractical to stand up because you're gonna fall over everything, your hose, your buddy, your furniture.
Maybe you're onto something there then. So if you can't see, it means it's really bad.
Yeah.
And so the lower they are, the better. And what you seem to be saying to me is it's better for you to drag them by the sheet.
It's probably practically better too.
If you can see to some extent, and you've got a reasonable awareness that the conditions aren't that bad, then maybe not so bad to lift them up if that's the way that works for you.
If that's the easiest way, If they're light, for instance, if there's a 60 kilo elderly woman, you pick them up and you drag them out. But if it's 150 kilo bodybuilder, it's a different ballgame.
It's a different ballgame, right?
So to continue that, because you mentioned something, of course, is very important. If they're in a closed room, so if they're in an open room, we try, of course, try to find them as fast as possible. Lots of things that, and again, like I said, drag them out the fastest way we can. If it's really bad, you probably want to keep them low because of both your own sake and their sake. Now, if they're in a closed room, I was taught, and basically all fire departments around the world, because we didn't have thermal imagers, so we felt our way around, find a door. We don't know where we are. We don't know where the fire is a lot of times. Don't know where victims are. So you open that door and you search that room. Now, what we knew from hindsight, and this took a lot of time because I wish I've learned about your research way before that, but UL in the United States was one of the first that really highlighted it for the fire service that, hey, if there's a closed door, the environment behind that closed door is probably pretty good until you came there.
Mm-hmm.
But as a firefighter, you never experience that because as soon as you open the door, it fills up with smoke. So you didn't think about it could have been very good before you got there. So the evidence, your evidence for yourself was it was bad when I opened it. No, it flowed in when you opened that door. So it's understandable that it wasn't really part of the fire service decision process. Should I arrive to the door and open it or not?
Where's the fire?
In that case, we didn't know. So, but it would be that if the environment's really bad outside, it's not in there.
Okay, so if somebody's sheltering,
yeah,
in a room that's okay, well, or reasonably okay, in our house fire experiments, it was quite interesting because just burning in a closed house, we set fire to an armchair, what's a regular upholstered armchair.
Yeah,
you'd only need to burn about 5 or 6 kilos of that chair to get a lethal atmosphere throughout the open spaces in that house.
Yeah, which is crazy.
Which would cause knockdown of somebody exposed, breathing that within a few minutes if they were exposed to it.
Yeah.
And so we had, as I said, we had an open bedroom upstairs and a closed bedroom upstairs. So the open bedroom became contaminated very badly.
Yeah.
As bad almost as the living room. And so if somebody was in that open room, you'd have to get them out within a few minutes of igniting the fire to give them a chance of survival. People in the closed room, the fire self-extinguished because it used up the oxygen in the room. So the people in the closed room, I can't remember the exact numbers now, but it was just a simple, ordinary closed door was great protection, and especially if you could open a window.
Yeah.
And as long as the fire that didn't then burn downstairs and destroy the house, you could stay for maybe an hour in that room, or at least half an hour, waiting for someone to come and get you through the window or whatever.
Yeah.
So you can shelter. Now, if fire service had come into that environment, so they'd open the front door, they'd be in a situation where you've got, I don't know exact figures now, but 5,000 or 6,000 ppm of CO in the mixed space from all that, and some cyanide. Nasty atmosphere. The people in the room upstairs are not doing too badly because they're sheltering behind a closed door. So you're saying, should I open that door and get them out, right? Well, if you do that, I would say you could approach them from the stair and open the door.
Yeah.
But the fire is now out, more or less, but we've got a contaminated atmosphere. And as we've been discussing, you've just got to get them down that stair and out the front door.
Yeah.
It's a short exposure. Yes, they can survive that. That would be doable. Not a bad thing. Would be preferable to go out and get them through the window without having to open that door, if you can,
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a judgment call, I mean, I was heavily involved in another incident in a nursing home in Scotland some years ago, the Rose Park fire. And in that fire, it was a long dogleg corridor with residents' rooms all the way off it. And these were all elderly people who couldn't walk, really. They wouldn't be able to escape without being physically rescued.
Yeah.
And some of them were open rooms, and some of them had closed doorways. And the ones in the open rooms were I reckon they were dead. The fire was in a cupboard, in the double cupboard leading to this corridor.
Yeah.
They had a lot of aerosol cans in, and the aerosol cans kept popping, and there was a pressure wave that then flew open the smoke doors between that and the next corridor. So the whole area got pretty badly contaminated. But the fire self-extinguished within a few minutes because it's enclosed. But we had about 1% CO in that corridor.
Yeah.
So it took quite a long time for the fire service to work their way through this system.
Yeah.
And it ended up with a couple of people, one woman in particular, who was in a closed bedroom of the original corridor. She was in there for nearly an hour before they got her out. And she was, because it was seeping, the smoke was seeping around the seals into her room, she ended up being exposed to a couple of 1,000 ppm carbon monoxide and a bit of cyanide. So she was up, she survived the immediate rescue, which included taking her down quite a bit of a smoky corridor to get her out. And she actually recovered consciousness in the ambulance and was talking to the firefighters, the ambulance people.
Yeah.
But she died in hospital within about 36 hours. And she had high 40s to 50% carboxyhemoglobin by the time she was rescued. And so, it really concerned me, this issue about the difficulty of getting to people and getting them out quickly, and how quickly you can access people and get them out, But an issue in that case was it a good idea to get these people out and then take them down a contaminated corridor? Well, by the time she was taken out, most of that corridor had been vented. So it wasn't particularly an issue, but it also some of the ones rescued a bit earlier. My feeling was it would be better to get them out as quickly as possible down that corridor, even though you're going to expose them briefly while they're being pulled out.
Yeah, no. I mean, there's no easy answers for some of those situations, but typically what I teach these days is very different what I was taught. I teach you want to kill the fire as fast as possible. We have thermal imagers these days, so we can find the fire really fast. And as soon as you find a fire, you can ventilate, and then you can create all those corridors between the opening and the fire compartment. You can create free zone, which means that now you can start open doors and get them out because you've started to ventilate.
If you do it quickly, that's good practice.
And if you know that there's someone in a certain room, if they're on call with dispatch, you can climb in through the window and take them out that way potentially. But most cases, we don't know that there is someone inside. We have to assume that every closed door is a bedroom and there's someone in there until proven otherwise. And we don't want to open that before. Again, I was taught to open every door as you search because we need to find either victims or fire. Which is now completely changed into it's a closed door. Ignore that because there's no fire in there because the environment is bad outside. It's not going to be bad outside if there's a fire in there. So we go find the fire, knock it down, ventilate as fast as possible, and then we focused on those closed doors where we have a higher potential that the people are alive. Now, there is still an issue because they maybe are bigger departments, so you have multiple crews. Now, if one crew goes towards the fire and extinguish the fire, and the other one starts searching meanwhile, now there's laws in place saying, if you go to a closed door, can you open the door, sneak in and then close the door behind you and then search that space and see if there's anyone inside while trying to maintain that barrier. Now, in Sweden, you can't leave the hose line. So you have there's a legal requirement, and I think the UK is very strict on that too. You can't really leave your hose line because that's your way out, that's your orientation, that's your protection. So, but in America, they don't have that requirement, so they can do those things. So we have legal differences in how you can operate, which puts boundaries, and I think you should. There's loopholes in the Swedish regulation that you might be able to use to do that.
It's very interesting about this discussion, and I think I really need to have a lot more conversations with guys like you because it's trying to look at the practical aspects of these different scenarios from the point of view of both of yourselves, but also of the best outcome for the occupants. And when if you can get in and knock down a fire quickly, obviously that's really, really good. But if the scenario starts to get away from you, and then it's a real issue about at what point do you clear the premises as quickly as possible. I always think about these RSET timelines. That there's this golden period when conditions are usually fairly benign in the escape routes, and there's an opportunity, a window to get people out of the building. But often in bad incidents, it's often missed. And there's been a delay in getting people to leave, which has proved fatal. We'll be talking about this soon, but I mean, Dusseldorf, for example, the airport was an example where a fire was discovered very, very early on by a taxi driver dropping off a fare at departures. And there was hot work which set fire to a ceiling above the arrivals, which was on the floor below. And he phoned up and reported the fire at an early stage. And then there was a whole chain of people went to have a look at it. airport firefighters went to have a look. They called an electrician. A long timeline, and it wasn't. And it was all getting worse, really bad, very quickly. And it wasn't till 35 minutes later that a general alarm was given to tempting people to evacuate the building, by which time it was too late. And they were actually instructed to walk towards where it flashed over in another hall. So, delays like that, I call them pre-warning delays, warning people to evacuate, I think are quite an issue that we need to think about more carefully. I know it's not simple, but...
of course, there is shutting down an airport is probably not cheap either. So someone has to make that call.
Exactly. So it's a tough call to make, isn't it?
Yeah, and even if I don't want to talk about Grenfell specifically, but that type of call where your strategy is to stay put, but the building design it's built to stay put. And at some point you realize this is not working. When do you make a call? And to do that when everything is okay is the best call, but it makes no sense because then you think everything is okay.
Yeah. No,
I guess, of course, at some point, if you're in that situation, when it starts going bad, you should really switch quickly. But that is easy in hindsight, of course, to say in those situations.
So always being in hindsight. But I think, so I think that's something that needs more consideration. Those aspects,
I don't think, I would guess, the same in Sweden, I would guess before Grenfell, for instance, I don't think that UK commanders put a lot of emphasis on that decision-making skill, when to stay put or not. It was not really an issue. It wasn't in Sweden. Like we have our stay put policy, which is based on our building construction.
Sure.
And that has sort of been to the assumption that it will work, and buildings do not work as they're supposed to a lot of times, which we know from experience way before Grenfell. That was just one type of things that make the building fail. So, I mean, the fire service has to assume that the building doesn't behave in the way that it should. I think that has to be an assumption. That doesn't mean we are supposed to be successful at those occasions, but we have to assume that it will not behave according to what it's supposed to do. But to have that mindset, I think about that if we deal with a fire, and that's, like you said, collect to links and technology like the thermal imager. We have still a lot of fire departments in the world that use the thermal imager for orientation, and they put it down, and then they use the right hand in the wall because they've been taught to follow the walls, and it's really, really slow process. And they have not made a switch that we want to go straight to the fire. We want to use the thermal imager as orientation tool. We are in the switch of where technology has challenged where very old beliefs and thoughts about how you should operate safely as a firefighter. And that switch hasn't been made because changing things in the fire service is very complicated for many, 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 many reasons. Laws, regulations, cultures, just the sheer amount of people that you need to change, and most of them don't have a lot of time for changing, like training. So it's complicated to change. But I want to jump back to not dilute too much from that. Because we talk about toxicity and the being good when you close the door for a long period of time. But of course, if you don't have to be there, you should be there because it is the dose building up, even though if it's leaking.
Yeah.
Now, you can probably, of course, extend that if you're a private, if you put a towel, like they did on the skyscrapers burning. I don't know what the English word for it. Put the towel under the door and wet it. That's probably good.
Yeah.
Probably good if it's leaking. But yeah, you're probably good in that sense, but for some period of time. The other thing, besides as a firefighter in that scenario, you want to shut the fire down as fast as possible. You want to ventilate. But the thing that I haven't got an answer to is if you start applying water, of course, firefighters apply water to cool the smoke. Okay, that's one thing. And we can get to cooling and we get to moisture also but the first thing I will ask about, when you start applying water in a mist or if you do a straight stream and it splashes around like a sprinkler system, you're basically washing the smoke also. And the more water you have, the wider mist you're also washing. Are you reducing the content of the toxic environment like CO and hydrogen cyanide if you wash the smoke to any extent?
Right. assuming that you're not affecting the combustion at all,
Yes,
you're just
no,
watching the smoke.
Yeah, part of the way.
Then obviously CO is not soluble in water, so you will have no benefit on the CO at all.
Yeah.
Also, you've got to be aware that we'll talk about more in a minute, but if you cool the plume, it's going to come down to breathing level, so you're probably going to get a worse exposure. Right, you're going to be exposed.
Yeah.
Cyanide, to some extent, you might wash out. Certainly, you will wash out some of the smoke particulates and the acid gases. Yeah. So, yes, you do reduce those toxic elements by having a mist or a spray on the water.
Yeah. So irritants.
Now reducing the irritants.
Yeah.
But if you wash them out, right? If you create a fine water droplet mist, there's a bit of an issue in that. Back to what I said earlier, if the particle size gets down to a few microns, then you can inhale those droplets. Yeah. And anything dissolved in them, you inhale.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, I would say the effect is going to be beneficial, other than the fact that you're not going to take any CO out.
Yes. So that was sort of my thought, but I hadn't. But I haven't seen any data like on actually washing smoke in that sense. But where I got it from was that there's a lot of water scrubbers industrially that scrub particles and gases and like corrosive gases like hydrogen chloride and so on.
I've done experiments with sprinklered and non-sprinklered fires measuring the atmosphere. So done some work on that.
So the follow-up question, of course, like you said, if you start applying water, now you will cool the smoke down and it will bank down to the floor. But you will also mechanically, which I think is a big part of firefighting today, where you will mechanically, when you start using a fog or a straight stream and so on, you will mechanically push things around because water has mechanical forces. So you hydraulically ventilate, we call it, inside a space. So you will push things around. Basically, anytime you use water, you will mix everything, regardless if you cool it or not. So it's just an unnecessary evil if you need to cool. Now there are some. So there's going back to the fire service. There's this philosophy difference where you have the safe firefighters say we always need to cool all smoke because that's safer, and you have still some diehard firefighter says, no, you should cool smoke unless you really have to, because if you start cooling the smoke, you will create that mixture. Because before we cool, we had better visibility down to the floor. We can see better as firefighters. If we didn't have an SCBA, you couldn't cool the upper head because you would have that inversion. The Americans call it the upsetting the thermal balance.
Yeah,
there is this stratifiering that is, which I think is definitely true still. But my big point is that you should definitely cool it because you don't know when it's going to light off. You don't know how hot it is. You don't know where it looks at different places. And the studies show that if you start cooling the smoke in the hallway, it gets better in adjacent compartments still. So I'm glad you're nodding. But going back to the where I don't know still is if we don't talk about the moisture. We'll get to the moisture and the specific moisture. But I'm hearing you say that it's at least it's not detrimental, and it's plausible that it's beneficial. That the more water you use, the more you wash the smoke, the better it will be compared to using a little bit of water.
My experience of this is experiments with water mists and sprinklers in compartment fires.
Yeah.
And it's a little colored from what you're getting at, really, because what I found is a big benefit of using the sprinklers and the water mist systems in that if you take a typical, like a flat, which we've done, you furnish a flat. We had identical flats furnished and with sprinklers and without sprinklers. With the sprinklered flat, we set the fire in the sofa and the plume was up to the ceiling. Once the temperature got to 100 or so, the ceiling level, it activated the sprinkler.
Yeah.
And of course that put the fire out.
Yeah.
And so the amount of mass of material that we burned, so the fuel that was burned that was good, making a toxicity, was very small because we put the fire out. Now, the only downside was if you were sitting in a little seat opposite this fire and watched it, you would survive, right?
Yeah.
Now, before the sprinklers went on, the smoke is at the upper layer, so you're not inhaling anything.
Yeah.
And you've got perfect visibility.
Yeah.
As soon as the sprinklers come on, the smoke layer descends to the floor.
Yeah.
You can't see very well, and you're inhaling whatever was in that smoke.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was very interested in, okay, how bad is that smoke?
Yeah.
And so we measured it.
Yeah.
And the bottom line was that the concentrations of smoke particulates, irritants, and toxic gases in that smoke, in that scenario, were very, very low.
Yeah.
And the temperature was low as well. So you could sit there and breathe that atmosphere without really suffering any great damage. Now, the only minor downside is you couldn't see very well to find your way out of the room. But if you're in a domestic room and you've only got a few feet to travel and the atmosphere you're in is not life-threatening, you can afford a little bit of time to find your way out.
Yeah. So
in that scenario, there's no question that the treatment was very beneficial. And even though there weren't necessarily life safety sprinklers, it would have saved your life. You know, it wouldn't be, you're okay. So in that scenario, there is a minor downside in that the layer comes to the floor, you're breathing it, but the composition of that atmosphere is pretty benign. Now, the only caveat would be, which is coming more to your scenario, if you've got a big fire in a compartment and you put a lot of water on it, and it continues to burn, and then this layer loses its energy, you've got potentially a nastier atmosphere coming out the compartment towards you, which you're now exposed to because you've taken the energy out and it's dropped, the layers come down to the lower. This is what I think you're getting at.
Yeah.
So yes, you are going to have some exposure, but and this is something we need to do experimentally, but I still feel that generally speaking, and I think we discussed a bit in my emails, that what you're exposed to is going to be relatively benign in that scenario from a point of view of toxicity anyway. You know, that so it's worth
using water.
You don't say, I'm not going to apply the fire because I want the layer to stay near the ceiling. You put that fire out if you can. Yeah. Is that more or less get to the point?
Yes. But it is there is a big difference, of course, because that sprinkler you're putting on, and it is two differences. One is it started very early, so the toxic environment is very low.
Sure.
And two, you're applying water to the fire in that case. In my scenario, I'm talking about applying water where I can't see the fire. Right? There's only I'm just hitting the smoke in the hallway. I can't see the fire.
Yeah, I see. Right.
So we're not making any difference to the fire unless some of the water steam mist will get to the fire.
You might not be hitting the fire.
I'm just cooling the smoke, and I will push it down. We're definitely that you will push that whatever plume is in the hallway, you're pushing it down.
Right. Yeah.
That's the downside. Are you better off with using a little bit of water just to make it non-combustible and safe for the firefighter to advance through the hallway? It's still hot, it's still toxic, it's down to the floor, but it's safe for the firefighter to advance. It won't flash over in the hallway. Or for the victim, are you better off using copious amount of water, not just making it non-combustible, but also trying to basically wash the smoke from a toxic perspective?
But it's quite complicated, really, isn't it? Right. So if we consider a situation where there's a fire somewhere away from you in a compartment,
you can't reach it,
and you can't reach it, right? And then the effluent layer is coming out, flowing above your head.
Yeah.
Right. Now, it depends a bit. I'm just thinking this through.
Yeah.
Depends a bit whether there are flames in that upper layer. Right. So suppose we think of a compartment fire, the fire is burning, the plume is coming out, it's cooled down to a few hundred centigrade or so, and it's not, the smoke is not on fire.
Yeah.
You know.
Okay.
And you put water into that smoke, but you don't touch the fire itself, so you have you're not affecting any combustion at all.
Yes.
Right. So you're not in any way reducing the amount of effluent produced.
Yes.
You're just mucking about with it.
Yes.
You're changing it.
Yes.
So in that sort of scenario, obviously because you make it come down, you dilute it a bit, but you haven't reduced the amount of toxic stuff that was in that original plume.
Yes.
So if you're wearing BA, it's no problem because you're not breathing it. If you're an occupant who's next to you who's being rescued or whatever, they are going to breathe it. Whereas if it was in the upper layer, they wouldn't be breathing anything. They'd be breathing air, wouldn't they? So it's all a bit of a trade-off, isn't it?
So in that case, I fully.
I mean, in that case, it might be if the plume that's coming out isn't a flaming plume, then and you've got a bit of time to get people out before while the layer is still above their heads, maybe hang on a bit. On the other hand, as you say, once you start to put a bit of water into that, cooling that plume, you're inhibiting it from going to flash over or having flaming in it. So you're making the overall environment safer. We're going in towards it. So it's a bit of a trade-off, isn't it? I wouldn't want to tell you not to put water in. I would.
No. And I want to continue this. I want to hamper on it because my position is that when we went from just burning wood, which we do in training in firefighters, which is a problem in that sense, went to synthetics, the flammability of the smoke changed dramatically. Because when you use wood and we're doing training, it's really hard to get wood smoke to burn. Like if you have the products of combustion coming from a partially or entirely ventilation controlled wood fire, this is very hard to start to burn again, even if you entrain air. Like you reduce oxygen, it's very hard.
Interesting, yeah.
You need a very high temperature. Yeah. Which is why firefighters are being taught to look at, the signs and symptoms of there's a flashover coming is because you see turbulent air. Because you need that temperature, because they've been taught that in training. The problem with synthetics that we have today is which we don't use in training for health reasons and environmental reasons, is that it burns in way less temperatures, which means that dirty fire. You have way more uncombusted fuel in the smoke. So it's impossible to ignite much lower temperatures, even at room temperature. So if you have a firefighter coming into a hallway and there's smoke flowing over their head, then maybe they don't see anything, but there's still going to be a very big separation toxicity-wise. I teach them to always cool because you have no ability whatsoever to judge by looking at it or just the thermal imager-wise to know if it's going to light off or not.
Yeah.
And if it lights off, of course, it's bad for people in the hallway.
Bad news for everybody.
Bad news for everyone. So you have to cool. Now, the question really, when I get back to is, if I start to cool, and if, let's say I have to cool or I decide I need to cool, is it better to put a little bit just to make it non-combustible, or again, to just copious amount of water to not, the smoke is going to dilute and come down. Yeah, basically wash the smoke. Is it possible to reduce tox, or is it basically just a theory and probably doesn't going to make any difference?
Well,
if you were laying in a hallway, you're going to get a bit more.
You're going to get a bit more of the particulates and irritants out, but I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. I mean, if you put a bit of water in there to stop sort of any combustion away from the compartment, that's a very good thing to try and achieve, isn't it? Beyond that, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. Not to the plume, we haven't got to the seat of the fire yet.
No, we haven't got to see the fire. That's a separate. Next question.
So I would say it doesn't. I don't. Yeah. So if you're saying put a huge amount of water into this plume, I don't. From a point of view toxicity, I don't see it's a big advantage to do that. No.
Excellent. So because the next question, of course, is when I do apply water. In same conditions, we're not at the fire. We're only in the hallway still. When I start applying water, I have hot ceilings and hot walls, and they might be off gassing or not, depending on how hot it is and so on.
Depending what fuels paneling or something.
Maybe it's you can have synthetic synthetic linings and so on. So they might be off-gassing or not, contributing to toxic environment, contributing to of course, heat, being radiated. Now, if I start applying water, I will create steam, even if I do a short burst of water. It's just about how much I create. Now, if I place a little bit more, I create more steam. And steam is excellent for suppression. Like, the more steam we have, the less likely it is to burn. But, and I will get to your take on this, it is at some point damaging to people and to firefighters, because every firefighter has been basically feel how it feels to be gets too much steam. It sucks, even if you're encapsulated in a fire suit. So there is this question. Either you use, and I'll let you expand on steam and why and how you know that it's dangerous to people, but either you use as little water as possible so that you don't create a lot of steam, just to make it non-combustible, or you go all the way to the other side of the bell curve where you spray so much water on everything that the water doesn't get to the point where it starts to vaporize. You keep it as basically liquid water. And if it starts to vaporize into steam, you're constantly using more water, so you condense that steam back into droplets. Basically, you're trying to reduce the temperature of the ceiling and the gases as fast as possible by using on the other side. Because if in the middle, just a little bit too much water for you need to cool, but you're creating a lot of steam, but not enough water to cool the linings down, so you stop producing steam, everybody knows you're in a bad spot. So too, I want you to just expand on, first off, steam. Is it dangerous for people without breathing protection with steam? And how do we know that? Just, can you start there?
Yeah, well, it is. There are two bits of information I'd draw your attention to. One is a nice simple one you might relate to, which is that the old breathing apparatus that firefighters used to use was a rebreathing apparatus.
Yeah.
So it had a cylinder of oxygen, a bag of some sort, and a canister of potassium hydroxide.
They're still in use a lot of places,
So what happens is you exhale your air. The air you exhale from your lung is fully saturated with water at body temperature, right? And the CO2 is absorbed by the KOH. I think that gives out some heat. And you rebreathe the same air time and time again. So it gradually heats up. And you keep up the oxygen from a little canister of oxygen.
Yeah.
And so the temperature of the air you're inhaling goes up and up and up. And what was found, in my understanding of the experiments with this type of breathing apparatus, is that once you got up to about 60 degrees centigrade, the air you're inhaling, fully saturated with water vapor, that was the hottest at which people could tolerate breathing that atmosphere.
Yeah.
That's 60 degrees centigrade. So I went and did some calculations, which I think I sent to you, of the amount of water that an atmosphere could hold if it's saturated. And we all talk about steam, but lots of nasty things happen way below 100 degrees centigrade. So, for example, up from memory, about 80 degrees C, the atmosphere is going to be nearly 50% H2O gas.
Yeah.
Right? And of course, the thing about any water is that if you inhale it, it contains a certain amount of heat, just the thermal capacity of the water. But the big issue is the latent heat.
Yeah.
So when water vapor condenses, it gives out a lot of heat. And that's why the highest temperature you can tolerate that is about 60 degrees, and it's going up steeply.
Yeah, so logarithmic.
Yeah, a real steep curve. So that was a revelation to me when I did these calculations. So 60 is about pretty close to the limit that you can tolerate. The other thing is if you inhale dry air at above about a couple of hundred degrees centigrade, you can tolerate it for about a minute, 200.
Yeah.
The amount of heat that it delivers to the lung is tiny because the thermal capacity of dry air is negligible. There is a bit of a danger that you can get burns to your lips. And so as a rule of thumb, again, we say that if the temperature of this is non-sprinklered, by the way, it's just this ordinary air or smoke.
Yeah.
If the temperature of the air you're immersed in is not so hot as to burn the skin of your face, then it won't burn your airway. If it's hot enough to cause skin burns, then you can get thermal damage to the mouth and the larynx. Now, if you get burns to your larynx, then you can get a swelling which can block your airway and cause asphyxia. Ordinary very hot smoke can cause burns in the upper respiratory tract, right? And sometimes I come across that sometimes in fire victims. They get usually minor burns to their mouth and throat, but not usually life-threatening, but it can happen, right? But you don't get any damage in the lung, because by the time the air's got to the lung, it's in equilibrium. The surface area of the lung is so large, it just absorbs all that heat very quickly. But there's a very unpleasant experiment done with a guy called Moritz about, must be nearly 100 years ago now, where he exposed dogs, anaesthetized dogs, to steam from a kettle. They got them to inhale, and he got massive damage to the lungs. So steam or water vapor near steam temperature is very, very damaging to the lungs, fatally damaging to the lungs. You cannot inhale steam. Right? So back to your sort of scenarios, this is where it gets complicated, doesn't it? So if you're inhaling air or smoke that is saturated with water, and it's at a temperature of above 60, say 70 or 80 odd degrees centigrade when you inhale it, I would say that could be very dangerous. So if you're fighting this, well, so the scenario you gave me was one where you haven't got to the seat of the fire, you're just dealing with the plume. If you take the energy out of that plume with water mist or water spray, and also mix it with air, which dilutes it, and you bring the temperature of that mixture down to below 60 C, then you would be able to inhale it reasonably safely. But if it's a higher temperature than that, and you put a lot of water in there, I would say that could be very dangerous. So the question is, what? It sounds like it's something that needs an experiment, doesn't it? When you have those sort of scenarios that you describe, what are the conditions in that plume that you've mixed down? How hot is it really? If it's saturated, we can assume it's saturated, right?
Yeah.
So if it's anywhere above about 60, 70 centigrade when you've mixed it, then it could be bad news, I think.
Because
not to the firefighter because they're protected, but to the other person. Yeah.
Because I'm having two thoughts in my head that doesn't coincide. So I'm thinking because I think the steam is a real big problem. I think it's not a problem at the same time, because I don't know how to think about this. So exactly as you said, that dog experiment is sent around the fire service as a proof for steam being, so that is actually being used, steam being a problem. And you look at when you cool, and if you look at, because measuring steam concentration at fires or a fire test is really complicated, as I understood. It's very, very complicated to know how much.
Nobody really does it. I mean, I did this on some experiments with the sprinklered fires.
Okay.
And I was happy to see that the temperature came down to about 30 centigrade.
Yeah, the temperature, but the steam, the
actual
steam. Yeah.
So there is no steam, you just get water vapor.
Yeah.
But it's saturated, but it's 30 degrees C, so it's okay.
Because that's
but if you had a fire that you didn't put out, you're putting water on a big fire and you don't extinguish it, then that's where you could get a very hot water steam-filled upper layer. That could be very nasty, Yeah,
because, for instance, UL in the United States tried to measure steam during suppression, and they sort of failed in their measurements. But what I could do, but because I was just applying if I had just assumed that the water will be saturated, the air will be saturated after suppression, or at suppression, I just look at temperatures and see what is the temperature, how fast does it drop.
Yeah, that's the best rule. I would say that makes sense. You assume it's saturated because you put all this water on it, and if the temperature is of a reasonable sort of level, then it should be okay, you know.
Yeah, and that's where it gets tricky, because you typically see, if you're doing that in the hallway, you typically see temperatures drop really fast down to about 100 degrees C. And from there, it starts to really level out slowly. Because, of course, it's very easy to put water up there and get it to when it latent heat of vaporization. It's easy to absorb that energy, but you go below that, it's really hard to cool that last bit, which is why if I only look at that, my assumption would be the faster I can get through that threshold from 100 to 50, the better it would be, which would indicate the more water I use, the faster that goes.
You might get to that point,
Yes.
I mean, you're getting beyond what I can say, really. I can tell you what it's safe to inhale, but it's quite it needs some experience, doesn't it, really?
I think it's definitely, because the other point I have in my head, so in theory, and I know that it sucks to be in there, I know that we can create an atmosphere that's 100 degrees, fully saturated, and deadly for people if we leave it like that. If we use too much water so that it stays high in the compartment, if we just use a little bit of water, we could make it stay high. Because that's the theory of gas cooling. So so
what you're saying is, if you can leave the plume high up, like take a bit of energy out of it to stop it flashing over or whatever,
then it's fine.
Then you're in a better control, maybe. I don't know. Yes, it's.
But that's the thing where so that's what we taught in Sweden and in Europe, just large extent. You use short pulses of water so that the water evaporates in steam. The steam expands, but when it hits the smoke and hot ceilings, but the smoke contracts, so the total volume doesn't really go up, and it stays fairly high.
Because you've cooled it, so it contracts. Yeah.
In theory. In practice, firefighters always over-apply.
Yeah.
Which means that you get the cooling of the smoke, and it contracts, but you get the mechanical forces pushing everything around, and you also hit the linings, and the linings don't contract, they just expand with steam, and you get steam expansion. So in practice, when you do that, you get sort of you're in the bell curve. You use too much to just make it stay high, and you're in the curve where you push everything down, and it's very hot and steamy, but non-combustible. So we solved that problem.
And have you experienced exposure to that kind of situation?
Yeah. Oh, every fire instructor has. It sucks. A lot. Because we also train in metal buildings with metal surfaces that creates huge amount of steam. Now, because I want to get to the other point, where I don't say that's not a problem. I do a lot of acquired structure burns where you do training in plaster boards and wood ceilings. And first off, you don't produce nearly as much steam because the linings are cooled. The surface material of the linings are cooled really fast and doesn't produce a lot of steam. So just the sheer amount of steam you're producing, it's much less, regardless of what you do, if you use a spray or a fog or a lot of straight stream. And that seems to indicate that the steam issue is much smaller than we think from training, where you experience this massive amount of steam and it just sucks and everybody would die if you don't have a BBA.
Yeah.
The other part is, which I want more of your opinion, is that if you look at the medical literature and you look at autopsies from fires, it's never mentioned that steam could have been the potential killer. My thought process was either, which I think is true, but still may not problem, the medical community is not aware that the firefighting behavior might increase steam and therefore kill people that wouldn't have died otherwise. So they're not looking for it. And if they're not looking for it, you're not going to find any evidence for it. But if you look at it, if say, okay, what would be the evidence? It would be lower damages in the lungs.
If it was steam, yeah.
And you would say that you don't find those typically at fires anywhere?
Right, yeah. Wow, yeah, right. So basically, damage to the lung is going to be a sort of inflammation. because there are a number of different things that cause that.
Yeah.
So there's the smoke irritants, and the acid gases cause inflammation of the lung. Whether you would be able to tell between whether it was heat damage to the deep lung or smoke, irritants damage the deep lung, I'm not too sure. Well, I think you would be able to tell. This is a good question for a pathologist, but if you got steam damage, I think it would show as a massive damage. I never heard of, not come across that. I mean, my experience is with heat and burns in fires is that most people who die from burns are intimate with the fire.
Yeah.
People who set fire to their own clothing or something like that. Most people who die, if people die in the compartment of fire origin, and it's still a bit of an issue, we're not quite sure what's going on there, but generally speaking, the bodies have a lower carboxyhemoglobin in than people who die in a remote location. Now, some people may have, so supposing you've got a fire across the room and you get a hot upper layer and you end up with a lot of radiation and stuff. In theory, you could die from burns before you die from toxic gases, or get pain from burns before you get incapacitation. And that must happen sometimes. But generally speaking, the worst burns are people who are intimate with the fire, flames. Nearly everybody I find whose bodies are recovered remote from the compartment of fire origin have well over the lethal limit of carboxyhemoglobin, which means they inhaled a fatal dose of smoke. And some of those are undamaged, unburned, right?
Yeah.
So they've obviously the smoke deaths.
Yeah.
But you do get bodies that the fire then spreads and burns the bodies. And so you get a burnt body, and if you can get some tissues from it, they always have very, very high carboxyhemoglobin.
Yeah.
So that means that they had time to inhale a fatal dose of carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide or whatever before the heat really got to them. So I believe that nearly all these remote deaths are smoke deaths, because when you think of smoke traveling through a building or toxic gases traveling through a building, they're not really absorbed by the walls, but heat is. Yeah. So the further a plume travels from the source of origin, the cooler it gets, but it still remains pretty toxic. So I'm not really seeing that as an issue. So inhalation of if you pour petrol on yourself and set fire to yourself, inhale those flames, you're going to get a lot of burns around the mouth and maybe in the larynx and the throat. You're not going to get damage deep in the lung from those flames. Yeah. Also, a point I made to you is that I wondered about the water that's made during combustion. You don't have to put water on a fire to get H2O, right? And what I found was that basically is simply the H2O concentration is roughly the same as the carbon dioxide concentration, which can get up to about 15% or so in a really extreme case, but usually it's 2 or 3%. So I thought about this, and I reckon that the humidity, the heat, the water content of an ordinary fire, a non-sprinklered fire, is not an issue. Yeah. It's not a problem.
Even though there's a lot of water from a non-sprinkled fire.
Even though there's water of combustion, it's not sufficient to significantly get you up that curve of H2O content. It's the gases you've got to worry about. Yeah. But if you put water on it, then potentially yes, as we've been discussing. So getting back to the medical side, just to finish that thought.
Yes.
I don't think it's something to be aware of, but I don't think that's going to come up. I don't think that's turning up as people are having lung damage from inhaling steam. But it might be missed. But it's certainly something you could flag up for pathologists to look out for. But I don't really come across that. I haven't come across that myself. I've come across people who died from hypothermia. Yeah. And there was one particular case, which is nothing else we should talk about. It's a big which I think is a big risk for firefighters, hyperthermia. If no burns, just get over body core temperature gets too high. This was a sad case of two people, a young boy, I think he's about 14 years old, and his adult went into a wood drying kiln I think it was in New Zealand. So it went into this closed room, which is used for drying timber, wet timber, and it was in there long enough. He died from hypothermia, just from, it wasn't at a high temperature. So that's another issue. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a big issue for firefighters, and also long term that it's been shown to instructors having a lot of exposure to heat from the period of time creates nerve damages and other stuff like long term. Yeah. Right. So that's definitely an issue. Just to close up on that, I would rephrase the question, see if I can clarify. Let's say the fire service was, due to poor firefighting principle, creating a lot of steam during suppression. If I'm correct, if I'm hearing you correctly, you don't see any evidence for that being the case because we don't see those lower damages in the lungs.
We can get lower damage in the lung. We usually put it down to chemical damage.
Yeah. So is it possible that chemical damage from your irritants are confused with heat from steam?
It's possible, but it's probably not likely. But I don't know. That's something we'd have to think about. Yeah. Because
I have those two paradigms in my head. One, I look at, could it be a problem? Yeah, if it's 100 degrees and 100% saturation, it's probably bad. Looking at the medical literature, it doesn't seem to be a problem. We don't find people.
Do you see? Can you? I mean, in my mind, there's a sort of stratification away from the fire. So you've got the fire compartment. Yeah. You've got stuff coming out of the fire compartment. You've got firefighters in the front line with BA putting a bit of water into this plume. Yeah. Then somewhere way back, you might have occupants that you need to get to and get out. But by the time you've gone down a few meters and mixed things up and cooled things down,
it's a non-issue.
It's not really an issue. I mean, if you were dragging somebody out from a room in the middle of all this, putting water up into the plume, right next to it, I can see a potential problem there. But that must be a pretty rare scenario, if at all.
Oh, absolutely. I would agree.
I think in practice, a bit like my people remote from the fire, by the time this steamy atmosphere has flowed away and mixed and entrained and cooled, they're not likely to be exposed to that kind of 100 degrees C condition. They're going to be down in the 30s, 40s centigrade or lower,
No, I absolutely agree. I think that the further away, of course, the likelihood of injuring someone is worse. But we also talk about the experience for the firefighter. That, if you're in a steamy environment, that sucks. If you're not, that's just better. Now, because we are in a, we'll get to the fire compartment also, because that's where you put it on turbocharge. This also, because the amount of steam you can generate and so on. But because we're in the clash, we have super simplified. The European approach has been to put small bursts of water mist into the smoke. And then when you get to the fire, you use water, you get water on the surfaces. But on the approach, you just get water and smoke, because we don't want to have the smoke go everywhere. It should stay where they are. It shouldn't be very dispersed. But in practice, over applying water makes everything go everywhere. That would happen in practice, I would fair to say. Americans have a wholly different approach. They have used straight streams, no bursts of water, just copious amount of water, just flushing everything down. Basically, the theory being using so much water, again, that you don't vaporize anything to steam. You want to keep everything liquid. You don't want to get any steam anywhere. You just want to push it away from you as a firefighter. And my experience, coming from the Swedish, who invented basically the European way of fighting fire with burst. The American method feels just way better as a firefighter, because there's so much less steam. And what feels better for me, it should feel better if there's a victim close to me, at least. Now, again, can we go into the fire compartment? Basically, most firefighters have been taught, when you get to the fire compartment, is, of course, you need to put water on the surfaces. That's no issue here. But for most cases, firefighters don't want to put too much on the surfaces because you want to have building conservation. You don't want to put too much water damages in the compartment. Now, in America, they don't care. I'm overgeneralizing here. There's lots of variations. But generally, they don't care whatsoever about the building because it's got to get torn down anyway. Disposable buildings, much of them. There's no history of saving buildings. We're just basically, so we're just going to over-apply water so that we can reduce the temperature as fast as possible to reduce the amount of steam as fast as possible to create a better environment for firefighters inside, but also the victims. So we have this two basically simplified versions. We have the European version where you try to use as little water as possible, keep the smoke high, limit the amount of steam coming down, limit the amount of mixing, good for property conservation, but useless. And we get into the fire compartment, then you're gonna generate steam. But they try to limit that, but try to limit the water damages. With the downside, it creates more steam. With the Americans, again, flow as much water as possible, cool it down, create a better atmosphere, but create heavily on water damages. Now, if we ignore water damages, let's say that that's a non-issue, which it is if we're talking rescue per people. Same question is here. Would it make sense to use more water, in that case in the fire compartment, to more quickly lower the temperature of the smoke plume coming from it with all the steam, but also, of course, temperature in the fire compartment and around with using just way more water?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a complicated situation, but I would say you want to take as much energy out of the system as you can as quickly as possible. With all the time, if you put a small amount of water into the plume and don't really suppress the fire, then the fire is still burning and consuming mass and growing and producing products. So the less fuel mass that ends up being burned, the less stuff that's being generated, generally speaking. So I'd be, but I mean, I'm getting slightly out of my field here. What's the most efficient way? What's the most efficient way to do it, really? But I mean, from my perspective, it's a question of safety for the people involved, not to put yourself at risk of getting engulfed in a massive plume of steam, you know.
Yeah.
But which is the most efficient way to suppress the fire? I'm not sure, really.
No, you don't have to do that. If you were just take my word for it, in that case, I'll use my words. You want to do the things that reduce the temperature of those surfaces and the temperature of that plume as fast as possible. Yeah,
because then you're stopping fuel from being burned and contributing to the scenario, aren't you?
Yeah, and that would be, if you look at firefighting studies, more water, almost regardless of how you apply it. Like if it's through a mist or a steam or a straight stream just moved around, a jet moved around, more water always seems to reduce temperature faster. Not as efficient in terms of how much water, but more effective in terms of reducing it faster.
Yeah, I mean, water mist systems are very good because they're quite good at suppressing without making a lot of damage, aren't they? So
which is excellent for a lot of things. And of course, one part of firefighting is doing property conservation, where you know there's no rescue and you want to use as little water as possible. And that's where Americans are really bad at.
I mean, we did one of my experiences with water mist systems. We did a aircraft fire test, and there was some thought at one point about having water mist systems on aircraft.
Oh, for the FAA?
Yeah. Well, we did it for it was the FAA and the British equivalent. We did it funded by the British one.
Because I've read a study on FAA on using water mists.
Right. Well, so we got a Boeing 707 fuselage, and we had a big can of kerosene burning. It was sort of as if it had been a post-crash fuel fire outside the fuselage against an open doorway. And then we put all the seats and things inside. And there was a dramatic difference. So when we set fire to this kerosene, it's a big fire, right? Yeah. But it's all outside the aircraft. it quite quickly set fire to the seating, and we had a really bad atmosphere within 2 or 3 minutes inside the fuselage.
Yeah.
And then when we used the spray system on the seats, the mist system, it just stopped. The seats never got involved, so we never got a fire inside. It was very effective. Yeah.
And in that study, if that was the same as the study I read, you looked at also about, you looked at hydrogen cyanide and CO and CO2 inside the plane.
Wow, yeah. I mean, I got very, very high concentrations of cyanide in the untreated fire.
Yeah, when you didn't burn,
Yeah, very quickly, yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's like, I didn't know that you were part of that study, because it has to be the one I read. Which is part of my decision. We're looking at, okay, so does it work out? Because I remember one of the conclusions of that study was, using water mist in that situation was not a problem. It was just good.
Yeah, it was a very small volume of water.
Yeah.
In the end, I think they decided well, there was one issue. It's a bit of an issue about if it's on the ground, it's okay.
Yeah.
If you spray water in flight and get a pool of water in the aisle and it starts to flow, that could be a bit of an issue.
With balance.
And I think in the end, it was decided on a sort of cost-benefit basis. It wasn't practical to go ahead, so they never adopted. But it actually was very effective. But it didn't. We weren't using it to extinguish the fire. What it was so effective at, impressed me hugely, was that just this small amount of mist onto the unburnt cabin contents stopped a large fire from igniting it. It's very effective.
Water mist by itself is, from my understanding, extremely well suited for shielding radiation with two tiny droplets.
Yeah.
And of course, a wet surface can't burn. So if it does get it wet, it's done. But I mean, but in that case, you didn't see any, or did you measure the amount of that mist turning to steam and actually creating steam potentially being a problem?
I certainly looked at. We tried to look at what a droplet collected the particulates. I think we were interested in the droplet. We didn't really, I don't think we really went into the steam aspect. I don't think steam was much of an issue, though, in that scenario.
I think I looked at the connection to just the same thing. I looked at the temperature and seeing that the temperature was so low that I don't think steam could have been an issue. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fascinating. I read the study. I didn't know issue was part of it. So because steam is such a huge, because it influences how operations should be dictated, like philosophy on how you should suppress fires. And I think that still, I would love to see more research into how potential steam production during firefighting, manually and sprinklers, have the possibility to affect both firefighters and victims.
Is that when I go on about this, people say, oh, well, people go in saunas, they're okay,
Yeah.
And I say, well, obviously the first place I looked when I was trying to work this stuff out was what happens in a sauna and what happens in a steam room,
Yeah.
And as you say, unless you're Finnish, when you go into a sauna, you put a bit of water on the coal and you feel the heat, don't you?
Yeah.
But when you look at what's happening there, the amount of water you're actually putting up is quite small.
Yeah, very small.
It's not saturated by any means. And in a steam room where it is pretty well saturated, I can't remember, you could only go up to about 30. You can't have very high temperatures in a steam room at all.
50, 55, and it becomes pretty much unbearable.
That's right. So see, there you are. You're approaching my limit, which I said was 60, didn't I?
Yeah.
So it does work. It is right. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've read in some places that it seems like when you get up to that magical marker of about 70, 75 degrees with 100% saturation, basically you can't burn anything and people can't survive.
You ask your colleagues, what's the highest temperature anybody can stand in a steam room?
Yeah.
Yeah. Even if they're Finnish.
Some will say, because it is still, but some would say, yeah, sure, but that only happens if you're continuously applying, or that only happens, at the top of the container, top of the, doesn't happen at the bottom. You have this big, difference in here. But I'm going, well, as soon as you use water, even if you only try to apply it to the top of the ceiling, you will mix everything because of that massive amounts of droplets sending in, so you will push everything down to the bottom. And then some would say, but that's only for a couple of seconds, then it gets better again. It's so hard. I constantly jump between.
I mean, it's probably not so much of a problem, I would say, because there's a big difference for somebody who's protected.
Yeah.
And if you were trying to rescue somebody, as we discussed, so if you've got protection, then you've got some kind of control over that, and you can adjust yourself a bit. You're aware of the problem, but you can adjust it, but you're not inhaling it, which is the big thing.
Yes. No, I would definitely keep, because I want to understand more also, and I want to also understand more, of course, how to explain it. I want to be a better instructor of trying to explain things, because normally firefighters, if I ask them what is steam, they don't know. They will point to the white stuff that's in the smoke. That's
one of the things that, the other thing about heat was, one of the things that, and Moritz, he did some quite gruesome but very interesting work, really. Yeah. One of the things he did was he exposed pigs, pigs, to very high temperatures that would burn their skin.
Yeah.
And looked at what they died of,
Yeah.
And from what I remember of his paper, what actually killed them was when the temperature of the blood entering the heart got to a certain went up by a few degrees. Forget that, I've got it in my thing somewhere. But when the temperature, because you're heating the body surface, and the blood going from the skin back into the circulation is going around the body. When it enters the heart, if it's gone up by a few degrees, and it wasn't very much, I can't remember what the figure was now, then the heart stops.
Yeah, wow.
And so they actually died. The actual cause of death, about 15 minutes after the exposure, was a heart attack. So that's probably one of the causes of death from burns in a fire, during a fire, something like that. But I mean, it's still an area that I don't think is fully understood. And then, of course, afterwards, if you get burns, then your survival in hospital depends on the body surface area burned and your resilience, and it's very age dependent, and there's quite a lot of data on all and
Yeah, there's still some. And again, for me, there's other outcomes of this, of course, but for me, its outcome is like does it affect to any notable extent how firefighters should operate when they, that's where, for me, the bottom line is.
Okay, what do you think about firefighters carrying some kind of protection for the people they're rescuing, like a hood with a bit of an absorbent in, or something like that, or a little oxygen cylinder or something like that? Because that would greatly help survival of when you're dragging, if you're in that situation where you've got to drag people out through smoke and heat. If you could take some kind of simple
absolutely
protective.
I think that's been around. It's been around in different versions now. Like in Sweden, we had the rescue mask. It was basically another mask. Now, that was good in theory, but in practice, in zero visibility, to get that onto someone's face,
just impractical.
You would put them on here because you have gloves on, and you're trying to find that
it
face.
Would be okay if you were in the situation where which came up in these blocks of flats, where you go into a flat that's not too where the conditions are okay, but you've got to get people out across a lobby and down a stair.
Yeah.
That's where there was something like that would really be valuable.
Yeah.
And in one of these cases, I noticed that the fire guys went up a stair. They came across somebody who was semi-conscious.
Yeah.
And so they took their mask off and gave her some oxygen, They gave her some air.
Yeah.
And that helped her survival. But of course, then they were exposing themselves briefly.
Yeah. But I think that, the common method right now, I think, around the world is some kind of escape hood. It's just a hood over their head, and it takes air from the firefighter's bottle, but it's just basically free flowing around the neck. So it's just very much easier, just put over the head and go out. But it's typically
simple.
Yeah, but it's typically not used. What?
Simple is good.
Oh,
Simple is
for
good
sure.
for these
Yeah,
things. Yeah.
But it's typically not used for the first one goes in, because they're not. If you find someone on the floor when it's zero visibility, the time it takes you to do all those things, to connect that and everything, you just better drag them out. It is
not practical.
For those situations where you find someone inside further in, you need to take them through the exposed part. You need to evacuate someone through the staircase, or the staircase is smoke filled and so on. You would put them on and then go through. Excellent, and those definitely are used by I would guess any major fire service in the world.
Okay.
So those it is just a balance between where it's practically possible to put them on faster than actually dragging them out, sort of.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
But there is we talked about a little bit those masks that exist that also it has some kind of chemical in them, or just solution that dissolves CO.
Yeah, sure.
One-time masks.
Yeah.
I'm surprised those didn't really got used more in the for private sector, in terms of if you high rise or whatever, and you buy those to protect your office or your family or whatever. Because they're fairly cheap disposable masks that you can do that. So you could go through the staircase even though it was in higher amounts of CO. Even though you don't have a fully, self-contained oxygen tank or whatever, because the amount of oxygen is probably always going to be high enough.
You don't. Yeah, I don't think you really need that. The oxygen mask, Well, I mean, it's nice if you could have it, but I mean, you could get to do a lot with something much simpler.
Yeah,
there would just be just a bit of an absorbent, keep the heat off your face.
Yeah,
and the smoke out of your mouth. It helps a lot.
But I don't think the general understanding of the fire service is that I would think, if you ask a firefighter generally, I would think they would say you need air, meaning they would say you would need oxygen. They wouldn't say, well, it would be enough just to take away the irritants, some temperature protection from the heat, and get rid of CO. That's what you need.
Well, that's why I think you seem quite to like what I was saying to you about using as a relationship to how the visibility is.
Yeah.
To make a kind of judgment. So if you can see a few meters, then you can pull somebody can walk through that without too much of a problem.
Yeah.
And if you can't see your hand in front of your face, then you've got to be very careful about getting anybody out into that. It was unprotected for any length, for more than a minute or whatever. Yeah.
I've also thought about it in the sense of, if you're a firefighter, you have a very limited amount of air with you. You have about 15 minutes to work hard, maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes, but then you're really not working hard. So, either to extend that air longer, or maybe more reasonable is as a backup option to have one of those disposable masks or whatever with you, so that you run out of air, you can put that on, and that will extend the amount of time for you to get out. Because again, the amount of oxygen is probably high enough for you to use that.
In most, most cases, yeah.
But those masks or systems that deal with that problem in that way they're lacking on the market, I would say. Those are not common. I don't know why, if it's the sort of demand is not there, so that's why they're missing.
I suppose there's also a downside. If you have something like that, that it's limited protection.
Yeah.
So if somebody used one of those and then died, then somebody might come looking for the manufacturer and say, hey, you sold this gadget.
Maybe so that's the case. And for professional use, it's always that, either it's good or it's not.
Yeah.
Better than nothing is not usually
not really acceptable. Yeah.
No, it's not acceptable. So if you go, but I'm going to use it in emergencies. No, you should have 2 bottles of air with you.
So I guess it all gets a bit difficult, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is like that. But from a reasonable standpoint, I mean, if I if it's better than nothing, it's still better than nothing. But maybe it is because of that. It's either good or it's not good.
Well, maybe that's Yeah, well, there we go. I don't know for certain, but you made a comment that when you had cellulosic wood for your training materials to burn, you sort of implied that the upper layer plumes that you got weren't very sort of fuel rich.
At least they weren't very flammable. Yes.
Yeah, flammable. That's the word you used, right? Yeah. Whereas I think you were implying that in real fires, when you've got sort of mixed polymer fuels and things that you can get more flammable ability in the upper layer plume.
Oh.
And I was thinking about that, and I'm trying to think about some of the experiments data I've got, and of course you can get underventilated fuel-rich plumes with any fuel, including wood.
Absolutely.
But there's a sense to which, with these kind of hydrocarbon-based polymers, if you have a fuel-rich system, you can get them depyralizing into sort of ethylene and propane and God knows what, sort of hydrocarbon-y type thermal decomposition products, which go up into the upper layer and haven't been burned because there wasn't enough oxygen. And I mean, there is some of that from wood, but it's not so much so. And I think you may be seeing kind of more unburnt hydrocarbon fragments in some of these polymer fires, which might explain what you're observing there, that there's more unburnt fuel up there to secondarily entrain and burn, maybe. I'm not sure.
Yeah, without explaining what I think it is, not even knowing, my observation is, and I think this is fairly sound, this is replicable over and over again, to get secondarily burning of wood, to burn the smoke from the wood. That's basically from not a super underventilated, just partially underventilated fire. You start to build up a smoke layer. That smoke is very hard to burn unless you get a very high temperature.
Right. Well, I would think that most of the unburnt stuff in that is going to be carbon monoxide.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas, and because wood is nearly 50% oxygen.
Yeah.
In the wood itself.
Yeah.
Whereas something like polyethylene is just carbon and hydrogen. So there's a lot more richer fuel in there, So I don't know, maybe there's something in there. I'm not quite sure, but it's something to think about.
No, it is. I mean, it's a great question because the reason it came up for me as an important topic, even though I haven't sort of entirely addressed why that is because we were teaching firefighters. So we were burning wood in fire containers, and we were teaching the firefighters we were teaching the firefighters the symptoms of flashover, and it always was, starting heat was building up. You started to have turbulent smoke up your head because it was all tied to temperature, because in the container with wood you needed that high temperature to get the rollover. What the problem was that in real fires, people going, I don't see those symptoms, because with synthetic fuels you would get those fire gas ignitions, you would get these backdrafts, you would get lazy white smoke igniting. So you don't. It was the problem I had was we're giving a false sense of I can anticipate flashovers and bad ignitions by looking at high temperature, because that's what I see in the container. While in real life we're dealing with synthetics, which might be much more combustible even at room temperature than you have smoke from wooden fires. Because we're seeing for instance, the Dutch were seeing, they had a couple of firefighters dying in intervals of cold smoke explosions. And that was from smoke from smoldering EPS plastics, polystyrene plastics in insulation materials on roofs in industrial facilities. That was the typical scenario. So you get this white, light, cold smoke throughout the industrial facility, and it just goes boom.
Very fuel rich.
Yes. But of course, their problem was they were not taught that white, wispy smoke was dangerous.
Dangerous, yeah. Oh, God, okay. Gosh,
because they were looking at, I'm gonna look at smoke when it starts to get hot and turbulent. I'm gonna worry about it turning to flame, not
the other thing that I picked up on when you were talking about you're advancing into a fire. You've got a team of two. This is in your video, and you've got one guy with the heat camera and one guy with the hose.
Yeah.
And you're talking about putting small amounts in at intervals and moving. You put a bit in, and you move forward, and you put a bit in and move forward. And you said something along the lines of, if on the video, the infrared video, it's white or whatever, then you know it's safe to move forward because there's no flame.
Yeah.
If it's yellow, you put a bit more water in before you move forward.
Yeah.
Is red hotter still?
Red is hotter still. Yeah, that would be
right. Then
the indicator.
If it's red, you just keep well away.
Yeah.
And I thought, some of the stuff we were discussing.
Yeah.
I thought that was a very neat kind of description of what's going on. So we had a long discussion about when and how much water you should be putting into upper layer plumes.
Yeah.
And kind of I'm saying, if you've got a heat signature which is white, which is below the combustible temperature, then it's not particularly helpful to put water into that.
No, it doesn't.
Because you're going to get the smoke mixing down.
Yeah.
If you see it, if you've got a camera on it and you can see that it's yellow, then you've got some benefit there because you're going to suppress the combustion in that layer. So that kind of, if you've got that kind of view on things, that gives you a better feel for when and how much water to put up there, maybe.
Yeah, at least that. I mean, 10 years ago, firefighters didn't have thermal cameras, so it's been in that sense a pretty rapid change in technology. And before that, firefighters basically had to guess when to put water up and how much. Now, the thermal imager is not a thermometer, of course. It measures radiation, and there's things blocking radiation. There's smoke blocking other smoke and so on. So you're not getting a true temperature of the smoke, but you're getting an indication that it's at least something in front of you is hot. You probably need to cool it right now.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So it turned into, and it is turning into sort of a tool like that. When should I cool and how much? As a helpful guide, because firefighters didn't have much go on before. Zero visibility. You maybe hear some crackling. You don't know where you are. You don't know really where you're going. You're just feeling your way with your hands. You're going, should I cool now? Or do I get yelled by the officer because I'm creating water damages?
Yeah.
It was a hard choice, and firefighters weren't getting good training on it because instructors didn't really know either. It was just, and back in the day, it was also like, we talk about heat. Now, back in the day, if you go back 30 years, firefighters didn't have very good protective equipment, so they didn't have, protection for the ears, maybe. So they would start, it started to get hot. I feel it in my ears. Now I need to start to cool. But modern day technology with your PPE you have on, you don't feel it's getting hot until you've been into the heat for a long time. You get saturated.
It's a double-edged thing because it's good protection, but it means that you're more likely to put yourself in danger.
Yeah, you're getting further in without getting. And the first time when we started getting better gear, a lot of the old fires were complaining, and they said this is stupid. We want to feel.
They can't tell how things.
Yeah.
They've lost some of your sensation.
Yeah. So that was a battle, and I don't think that really got won until thermal imagers replaced. Now we don't have to use our ears as thermometers.
Yeah, it's a thermal imager. Yeah.
Now we can actually use a tool.
Okay.
But we're still struggling. I would say in the fire service with. I mean, it sounds simple questions, but when to cool and how much, we still struggle with that. There's so many philosophies.
Yeah.
And I think that UL in the United States are doing some work to try to address that, but they're working from an American perspective, not from a European perspective.
Yeah.
So, but it's on the other side, it's interesting. There's lots of things to do.
Yeah. Okay.
And I get to talk to people, and I get to think, and researchers like you to build that puzzle of bits and pieces, because we also have a problem. Of course, firefighters don't understand the researchers, and researchers don't understand the firefighters. So there's a constant mismatch of words and you know, what is the actual problem we're trying to solve. We're attacking it from different angles.
It's a shame, really, because I used to go and teach at the Fire Service College in Morton. And they used to do a lot of training courses for firefighters at different times in their careers.
Yeah.
And it was all well funded and that. And then it was all cut back, you know, and they more or less closed the place down. And I think there's less of this kind of training than there used to be, you know. It's a shame.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, and you know, it's all about money, of course.
Yeah.
But I think there's still room for doing it. It's just that it has to be, I guess, there has to be stronger advocates for creating that type of research, for instance, and training. And I think in the scientific community, there's not a lot of incentives to do it because that's not where the grants may be and so on. So the system is mostly not geared towards, you know, making firefighters safer. Is if any, making, you know, society safer in terms of fire prevention. But that's mostly geared towards how to build cheaper without killing people.
Right. Yeah.
You know, how can we build cheaper?
In our country, historically, I mean, it's all been upended now because post Grenfell. But historically, there were two camps really. So there's the Home Office that controlled the fire service.
Yeah.
And they had their own funding for their own research.
Yeah.
And then there's the building regulations, sort of Department of Environment-y type people who were responsible for building codes and building regs and things like that. And that's where most of our funding came from.
Yeah.
One time we used to do work for both, but it kind of, you know, changed over the years.
Yeah, and I guess there has to be advocates from both sides to make it happen. You know, and the fire service has for sure not been. I'm talking globally and so on, not been champions of requiring and demanding and wishing for research, because the fire service, again, I think I mentioned before, pretty much thought we got it nailed down. We're the shit. We're the best. We know it all. So why do research if we're already the best? I think that has been, you know, generally. So if the fire service isn't really asking for it, the politicians is not going to allocate fund for it, and the scientists are not going to look into it because they don't even recognize there's a problem. If they ask the fire service, the fire service goes, "Yeah, no, we're good. You know, we got to figure it out." So, but I hope that will be. I hope we're. I think that generally there's so many people poking and scratching surfaces and so on, and go like, I don't think we really got it figured out. I think there's many problems to solve. But like I mentioned in my lecture, I think that it's also about like sprinklers. I don't understand. I think I mentioned that. I think this why sprinklers are from the ceiling always. Because when you put on ceiling, it pushes everything down just because of that mechanical force.
I picked up on that. Yeah, CFD is pretty good at calculating how gases move around.
Yeah,
right. Plumes move around it and stuff in trains. It's not so good still for the actual fire itself. They can't really model the combustion very well still. But the thing that was going on that they were first trying to do, and I suppose it's advanced a bit since then. But you picked up on this a bit in one of your talks, is that I remember somebody had a project to try to correlate the effect of a sprinkler droplets on a CFD fire, you know, have a CFD model of a sprinklered fire.
Yeah.
And from what I remember talking to people about that, it was a pretty difficult thing to do. I don't know whether they've cracked it yet, but it wasn't that simple. It's quite a complicated thing because you've got all sorts of physical stuff going on, but you've also got a lot of weird evaporation and all. There's a lot going on there.
There's so many factors, like, and that's a
very complex thing to try and model. Yeah,
I learned that because there was I started dabble a little bit by those fire modeling softwares, the NIST modeling, FDS.
Well, you've had to go with FDS, have you?
No, I not myself. I used a friend because I didn't want to learn the program because that would take a lot of time.
Dude, exactly. I've never done it.
No, I dabbled with it in terms of I found a person, a great guy in Austria, because I was interested because in like 10 years ago the the sort of the National Investigation Organization for Large Accidents did a report on a fire in Sweden where 7 people died. So and they did a computer model, and that was 10 years ago. So I was interested in seeing that. FDS has come a long way. I was interested because there were certain things that didn't add up. I think when I read that report, I didn't. My gut feeling says that this doesn't really. There's the elements here I don't really get.
No, don't seem wrong.
Yeah. So I took all the data I could find in the report and tried to create a model. I was unsuccessful because there was really not enough information in the report to really build the model in any good way. So I don't really know if the original authors had more data that they didn't publish in the report, or if they just assumed all the rest of things and just went no. Because whatever they found out in the model didn't match what the people saw, and that was my big thing.
That's the bottom line, and that's what I've been doing a lot of in these fires. I say it's another tool to bring to the party, and you need to correlate it against other things.
Yes.
And that's what we did when we did the Mont Blanc tunnel fire.
Yeah.
I looked at the toxicity data, and we had CFD modeling of the tunnel fire.
Yeah.
And I was able to take that and calculate if people had been exposed to the conditions in the CFD model, how far along the tunnel would they have been able to walk before they collapsed?
Yeah.
And then we compared that with where they actually collapsed, and the timing of when they collapsed from other data, and was able to show that it was a good fit with our core. We did several different CFD versions with our core CFD version, so it gave us confidence that it all fitted together and therefore made sense. But if you just do it cold and go forward model, I say forward modeling is all very well. But forward modeling can go in lots of different directions.
Yeah.
If you know what the outcome was in some detail, then it constrains those models, and you can you can fit things in better to find something that works. Yeah.
Yes, I think that was one of my basic. Like, you could sort of try to recreate something if you know sort of a lot of benchmarks along the way. It looks like this over here.
Yeah.
But to make predictions.
Fire is very difficult to predict.
Yes. And that was because I really wanted, because what I actually wanted also to do in that one was I wanted to play with variables. What happened if the fire service did this and this and this? And I didn't get to a point where I could even replicate.
You could really do that.
No, so I didn't. I wasn't successful. I mean, it was something I did, as a hobby, and the guy in Austria was also doing just to help me, and it just took massive amounts of time just to make the models and everything. So we were just doing basically for fun and to learn, but that was my first big realization, that you had to make so many assumptions for the models to even make sense. Like, you have to assume a certain heat release rate, of course. You have to assume a certain amount of how much energy is being dissipated through the walls and everything. Even if you know sort of a lot of the variables, what kind of wall materials you had and everything, you still had to make a lot of assumptions to even get close to
exactly.
But for now, I think it's hugely valuable still for a lot of things. I think it's a good tool. It's just that you have to be really careful in how to use it, and how they used it in that fire. I would say that didn't make any sense, because they were just doing a prediction on how they think it would. It didn't match the actual, I think, the results really well. Right. Now, it didn't change anything, so it wasn't like the model, put someone in jail or anything. It wasn't. So in that case, I would be more sad about it. It was basically, it didn't really explain the things I wanted to be from how the fire service operated, for instance. And I don't think, I've never read anywhere in Sweden where I think that the models have been used to sort of like it that way, to put someone in jail or something. Right. Okay. I think that would be highly problematic. Yeah,
it would. Yeah.
But like, for instance, NIST does and did a lot of stuff when they do those models and try to recreate it, and use that as an explanation tool and a visual graphics to show the development as a teaching tool also, and that is phenomenal. because you can visualize the flows and where the heat goes and what happens when windows break. For that, I think it's phenomenal.
Yeah.
You brought up something that I want to also ask you when I have the chance. We talked about different temperatures and different types of products from the same fuel. So if you take pure wood, let's take pure wood.
Yeah.
And you expose that to, now take a board. So if you put that board in a room that's 200 degrees, 500 degrees, of course that board won't be unanimous temperature. It would be at some point it would have a surface temperature and would be entirely different temperature on the bottom. Because I'm in my head trying to understand the relationship between heat release rate and, in that case, radiation on the surface versus the temperature in the room. So because if I want to do a practical example, I want to create smoke for firefighters to train. Okay, so if I don't use theatrical smoke, I use wood, and basically you want to try to create wood from you want to create smoke from wood in some basically industrial way, but it's not industrial because no industry will create that kind of smoke. It's just nasty. So you want to have good smoke for training. That should be maybe sometimes flammable, sometimes not, sometimes very thick, sometimes very thin. So you try to balance that. So you have somewhere you put some wood in, and you make a fire, and you limit the oxygen to some degree or more degree. So you have those variables to play with. Now, I want to explain you this context before I ask my question. My experience is if I take a room and I insulate it and I put some wood in there and I burn in it and I close the door, I get a really high temperature because the insulation keeps a lot of the energy left in the room. But the rate of pyrolysis, the rate of off-gassing goes down fairly quickly, even though the temperature is very high if I put thermocouples in there. Because I get the heat release rate, it goes down a lot. So I guess the radiation to the surfaces goes down a fair bit. So I can have 600 degrees, but 600 degrees inside the room, but relatively the rate of off-gassing decreases because I have gaps everywhere, and the amount of off-gassing coming out of those gaps reduces greatly. But if I put a fan in there, it could be a small fan, so I increase heat release rate inside that space. The temperature might go up just a little bit. Maybe it's 600 degrees, maybe say 700 degrees, but the amount of smoke I start producing is exponentially higher. I'm trying to wrap my head around the relationship between, however I'm supposed to think about it when creating a lot of off-gassing materials from wood. Can you try to explain how I should think?
Right, let me try and talk my way through this.
Yes.
Right, so let's have a piece of wood and put it down.
Yeah.
We used to like working with something called cribs, where we'd make a kind of...
Yeah.
You know what a wood crib is? Where you put bars.
Standard wood crib.
So if you heat wood up somehow by radiating it or whatever, then to start with, nothing happens. And then as it gets hotter, it starts to give off a bit of water, right? Once it gets above 100. And then once you get up to 200 or 300, about 300 degrees, it starts to pyrolyze.
Yeah.
Now, because we need to make a distinction between char-forming and non-char-forming fuels. And wood is a char-forming fuel. So what happens is then that you start to break down thermally. So you've got pyrolysis. And pyrolysis is just a breakdown by heat of molecules of the lignins and polymers in the wood.
Yeah.
But if it's in air, you get oxidative pyrolysis, right? Yeah. So there's a certain amount of exothermic oxidation going on. But at the moment, you've got no flame. You haven't got enough of a fuel-rich hot mixture to ignite with a flame.
So it's a reaction with oxygen and heat, but it's still not combustion.
No, it's not.
It's borderline combustion.
Well, then you can start. There's no glow yet, right? There's no flame or no glow. There's not combustion, but there's some oxidation going on, and you get a kind of whitish smoke coming off.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about that is that you find that it's very irritant if you get it in your eyes, because those oxidation products are organic oxidation products like formaldehyde and acrolein and things like that. They're very, very irritant, nasty things. They really sting your eyes and you have to breathe. But of course, this process is very slow, so it's not particularly hazardous because you're slowly producing smoke into your environment.
Yeah.
Then you get a bit hotter, and you might get a glowing coal, a smouldering glowing coal.
Yeah.
And actually, I found in the experiments I've done that the chemistry of that is very efficient. There's almost the same yield of products as a flame. But you tend to get quite a lot of carbon monoxide coming off this kind of conditions.
Yeah.
And then if it gets hot enough, then you start to get ignition. You've got flame ignition. You've got enough fuel coming in, right? Now, let's say you're doing this in a room, and you've got it's an ISO room, and you've got the ISO room doorway fully open, right? Yeah. So this is a well-ventilated fire. So air goes in at a low level into the doorway. You've got your burning crib. You've got a nice big fire going there. And your upper layer will be initially room temperature, and then it comes down and it flows out of the soffit, out of the doorway, and you get the layer forming. I'm sure you're familiar with all this. Yeah. And you've got your thermocouple tree in there, and the upper layer temperature sort of goes up 300, 400, 500, 600, depending on how good a fire you've got in there. Yeah. Maybe it gets up as high as 800.
Yeah.
It can't flash over because you've only got one lump of fuel. So there's nothing for it to flash to, really, Yeah. So you get, but what that combustion, because it's well supported, well fed with air, is pretty efficient combustion. So that, like I said, the main products of efficient combustion are carbon dioxide, water, and heat, and a little bit of particulates. So you get a bit of smoke coming out. But that smoke is pretty, what I call dry smoke. It's sort of, if you let it settle on a surface and go back a few hours later and feel it on your fingers, it's powdery stuff. So there's not much in the way of chemicals in it. It's pretty innocuous. Okay. Yeah. Now, if we start to shut down the doorway and we've got a good fire going in there, and we shut down the doorway and we starve it of oxygen, then we start to get a limited amount of air, still 20% air entrained into the bottom of the plume. But as the plume goes up into the upper layer, it becomes has limited entrainment, and so it becomes fuel rich. And so now you've got equivalence ratio of something like 1.5, maybe, right? And you're getting inefficient combustion. So now the smoke particulates get worse because they survive; they don't get combusted by the flames. Yeah. The carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide ratio changes. So now you start to get a lot of carbon monoxide coming up into the plume, and you also get a certain amount of unburnt organic products, right? Which are a whole range of different things. So you've got a series of hydrocarbons from methane, and mostly methane and ethane, propane, things like that. Bit of benzene, bit of phenol. Where the oxygen comes in, you've got phenol, you've got formaldehyde. So these products are to some extent irritant, and they're fuel rich. Now, I think that what you were describing earlier, well, if you just shut the door, then the oxygen concentration all throughout that thing is going to drop quite a lot. And so although the temperature might still be quite high in there, it can't really combust because there's not enough oxygen to combust until you let some back in. And that's probably why you see the fire dropping until you let more air in, and then of course it can start burning again. Yeah. Does that kind of fit with what you observed?
Yeah. So what am I, if I'm at the stage where it's struggling to burn, the door is halfway open, you're saying you're getting some oxygen in, you're creating of course, unburned soot particles. You're creating, of course, carbon monoxide, a lot more carbon monoxide than before. You're saying those organics that need oxygen, like formaldehydes and those types. But if you shut the door entirely, then let's say, just for simplicity, that the temperature stays the same, but then of course the yield of what you're producing now will change somewhat.
Well, I mean, if you shut the door, the flame will die right down, won't it?
Yeah.
Because don't forget, the flame is at about 1,000 degrees. The actual flame itself. All right. If you can see an orange flame in there, it's hot, right? So most of the chemistry is going on in that flame zone, I reckon. There's a bit of chemistry in the upper layer, but it's mainly where in and close to the flame, where you've got these really high temperatures. So once you shut the door, all those go. You know, and it's actually a lot cooler in most of the important places than you maybe think it is.
Yeah.
I mean, the average temperature in the compartment might still be 600, but the bit that matters, you know, I think it's something like that going on. I mean, one of the things that we observed, though, when we did it, I've got a lovely video with this somewhere that we did, where we tried different levels of doorway closing, and we had these fuel fires going on in the ISO room, and then we would have a plume coming out, and then we'd shut the door, and because we'd shut the door, not shut the door, but had a narrow strip, you know, a narrow door, three quarters shut, right? So what happened then, of course, is that the amount of smoke coming out is restricted. So the layer descended deeper inside the room, right? And then when it descended deeply in the room, it tended to suppress the fire, right? Because it got down to the flame zone. And because it suppressed the fire, the stuff coming out decreased, so the layer went up again. So it would oscillate. It did that for a bit, and it's coming out, and then suddenly it all shut down. And we thought, oh, what's going on now? And then suddenly there was this massive sort of backdraft event where it all came pouring out, you know? So you get some really interesting dynamics going on in these scenarios.
So if I were to say, hey, I want to design the worst burning fire, but it should sustain itself. If you were to design a room or a stove where your objective is to create as much, let's say, to define it, visibly soot particles. So I want, from a piece of wood, you take your pile, or you take your iso crib, and we put it in a room, and I want it to burn. I want it to keep burning. It should sustain itself. But it should produce as much soot as possible. How would you think about where to put the openings and everything to make that happen?
I think I would simply put some good fuel in there, saying like an ISO room, and then stop it down to about 1/2 to 3/4 of a doorway width. Or another way of doing it is to put 2 holes in, you know, up hole and lower hole, and restrict the ventilation. Would I want to expose people to? I wouldn't want anyone to breathe this stuff, though.
No. That was not part of the equation. No, but
it's just for demonstration purposes. Are you limited to? Could you try different fuels as well?
But yes, from a theoretical point, but from a practical standpoint, most fire training, at least in Sweden, it's different around the world, but mostly is fire service burns what they can get for free. Because fuel is expensive, it's used a lot, and the free stuff is wood pallets. That's one of the most common fuels, because old pallets are discarded, so you burn them for training. You get them for free.
Okay, that's probably the best. I mean, also you've got to be careful what else you would burn. You know, you wouldn't want to burn some other stuff if you didn't know exactly what it was made of. Yeah,
you want to burn something that's, so you want to have something that's the problem with fire training. Of course, you want to have something that's cheap, which is in that case pallets. You can have discarded sofas, but then they would be very high fidelity in terms you get black smoke and really foul, but it will be very dirty and very carcinogenic and so on. So you try to settle on the middle ground, which is sort of pure wood, cheap, but also not.
Be careful about the treatment the pallets have had as well.
Yes, you don't burn those. You only burn pure wood pallets. You don't burn those.
I think that's a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah. So that's pretty common, that, you know, not burning those pallets that are greenish because they're treated with not to rot. That's a no good. So I think that's fairly common. But again, you're burning wood and you're trying to, again, this is the problem with fire training. You're trying to create something that looks like reality. Which of course is not, because usually you're limited to a fire that doesn't go anywhere. It just stays in a corner or whatever you put it. So that's one of the issues, that doesn't look like reality. But also you're trying to look like, so that the heat and smoke coming out of it looks like sort of something that it might be looking reality. So it has to be dirty in some sense, because we haven't figured out what someone should really figure out. A training smoke that's hot, or can be hot, that's visibly obscurative, but not environmentally or health-wise dangerous.
Yeah.
But that seems to be like a physical or chemical problem, because you, like theatrical smoke, you can't get hot because it's propylene and it breaks down at about 7 degrees. So you can't get it hot.
But almost by definition, the more you make the smoke blacker and denser and more vitiated, the more other chemicals you're making in that smoke.
Yeah.
I mean, to some extent, the chemicals in smoke, I say, are a mixture of things that you get much the same mix of things in all burning materials produce a sort of set of things that are pretty well common. Well, they all make methane, ethane, propane, benzene, styrene monomer. These are all products of ring cyclization and the chemistry of combustion of just about any fuel, right? Yeah. So there's a whole range, and these oxidized things as well. So there's a whole range of stuff that is pretty well common to most things. And then you've got another set on top of that, which depends on the individual chemistry of the thing you're burning. So something like nylon will give you a different mix on top of those things than wood. Yeah. Or polypropylene or polyisocyanurate or polyurethane will give you other things on top of those, which you have to be aware of. But anything that burns can give quite a mix of carcinogenic, PAHs, all those kinds of things, you know?
No, we have that problem because there's a huge debate, of course, how to balance the health of the firefighters doing training, because, of course, you're wearing breathing apparatus and you're wearing protection gear. So you're exposing them to something dangerous, to be able to learn how to deal with something dangerous in reality. Because if you don't put them through anything, they don't know what to expect. They don't have no concept of a real fire. So I think that, virtual reality and stuff like that will at least help in the future to visually create some of those things. But they haven't come far enough to replace that real fire training yet, at least in my opinion.
I have had some involvement with this. This come up as an issue, and I mean, to some extent, one of the exposures that firefighters do get on a regular basis to fires is when they go back for training. When they go training, and you have to be quite careful about the contamination of training sites. Yeah. And so, are something you need to be aware of. And of course, the guys who are perhaps most at risk there are the instructors, because they're doing it on a regular basis. Yeah. And all the things we were talking about, skin protection and is very important. And if you're spraying a lot of water around on fires every day, you have to think about soil and water contamination and off-running and that kind of thing. And that's another good reason for being very careful about what fuels you might burn for training purposes. You don't want to have a nasty contaminated site.
No, and that's the fire service has, I would say, and it's still when it comes to soil contamination from training, that became a huge issue with PFAS and so on, because from foam training,
of course,
so that blew up, but just from normal fire training, I don't think that hit the radar. I don't think any fire service in the world has really hit the radar on. We might need to think about where the water is going from our normal fire training, which is just in quotation burning wood. You're still producing nasty stuff that you're going into the ground. The problem is it the levels high enough to become a problem, or are they broken down in when they pass into the water treatment plant, get out in the water, and then it's basically diluted to any extent that really matters? Or is it possible that you're contaminating the soil or the water runoff to the point where you actually do create long-term effects for the area where it's just near you? And I don't think there's enough. I haven't seen enough research on that, if that's really the case or not.
It has cropped up as an issue in some countries, but yeah.
I've talked to some researchers that just say, well, we're on the fence on is it a problem or not. But I think, like everything, you should apply if you're concerned, you should try to limit it, the precautionary tale. So for instance, for fire training, I've been thinking about, and this is not really doing, but more cyclic water. So you're using the same water all the time. You're just repurposing the water instead of flushing it down the ground. Now that creates new problems because you're continuously making it dirtier and dirtier and dirtier, the water. So you need to clean the water when it's circulated around on the training field and so on. But I think that will be an issue that more services have to wake up to, that we can't just use fresh water that's a limited resource in a lot of places in the world and contaminate it and just flush it down in the ground, and it goes wherever it wants to.
Yeah, it's going to get tighter, isn't it?
Yeah, that can't be a sustainable way of operating the fire service, as long as we keep burning wood, which I think still is a necessity from a training standpoint. I haven't seen a solution to that problem. So you have to manage those risks rather than eliminating those, because we can't really eliminate them yet.
I would think if you're sticking to wood cribs, though, you were wood pallets, you're minimizing that problem, really.
Yeah, from what I've read, at least you're minimizing. That's the word, at least I like to use. You're minimizing those risks, both to people and to environment around you. But of course, you're always, again, I'm trying to, whatever instructor will do automatically is that they want to create as nasty smoke as possible.
Of course.
So they will try, because it just looks better. It just reacts better. You get better training. So you will take that piece of wood and you will do whatever you can with that piece of wood in terms of limiting oxygen and so on to get it burn as nasty as possible to create that scenario. Yeah, I've been around the world, and you get those. You maybe, for instance, build a propane facility.
So what about putting green wood on, or green material on?
Well, yes, there's definitely those. You would put other, or you would mix it with diesel and so on. So you would create it, but just to this an example where it's, you build a propane facility and you burn propane instead, and that would be considered from a health perspective would be a better system because it doesn't create smoke. You flame and theatrical smoke. Now, from a training standpoint, I think it's horrible because it doesn't look like a fire at all. You don't have any smoke. There's nothing. It's just horrible. But what instructors do, if they can, is they will start to trick the system. So the system might be built so that you have to have a doorway open to get enough oxygen and air to the propane flame and everything, all those safety features that the manufacturer built in so that you couldn't burn it without too little oxygen to create smoke. So the instructor will start to bypass those features when the managers are not seeing. So they're trying to close doors, and the breakers for the doors, they can put tape on it so that they can close the doors, and they try to limit oxygen just because they want so badly to deliver better training for the students. So they're trying to game the system just to make it look better. And so I'm still, as an instructor, I want to build better fire training. I'm still trying to go like, how can we build this better? But I'm struggling because it seems to be sort of a lot of chemistry. Like you said, as soon as I'm trying to make worse smoke, a better looking smoke, I end up with smoke. However, I do it in a more cancerous or environmentally worse smoke. And that's a problem.
Yeah, that's bottom line, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just need some scientists to come up with a dirty-looking smoke that's
dirty-looking
clean.
theatrical smoke. Yeah,
that's clean and can be hot and so on. Which, that would be excellent.
Yeah.
So, are you still involved in doing fire research?
Well, I just completed a very heavy involvement. Well, finished about a year ago now with Grenfell, and I decided it's time for me to
pass the torch.
Retire, really. Yeah. So
but there's so much knowledge in that head that needs to stay in the field.
You might see a couple of papers out of me yet from stuff I've got in the archives, but I'm quite happy to discuss things with people, but I don't want to take on any more formal work, really.
You can assist. No, it's so much that. But I realized that there's a huge new era of fire research where you look at toxicity when all the batteries and solar panels and stuff like that, but you mix that in.
Big issues coming up there. I mean, what I've been involved in mainly in recent years is fire incidents.
Yeah.
And I find them a tremendous learning opportunity where every case, because you've got an opportunity to study something in considerable depth.
Yeah.
And you've got all the different aspects. You've got the occupants, the behaviors, the fire, the dynamics, all these things coming into one thing. And so every case you learn so much each time you do one of these things, So they are very interesting from that perspective.
Well, this was great. I hope that I can gather my thoughts and maybe ask some more questions in a later occasion.
Sure.
But it's been confirmed some of my thoughts. I have new thoughts, which is always great. And it will, I think a lot of people will find this very interesting because there's a lot of things I don't think they have considered in how they look at firefighting and how they value different upsides and downsides. There's always a trade-off.
I mean, one little point I would also like to make from a point of view of firefighter health is don't inhale smoke, even if you have just a simple mask, and be very careful about getting soot on your skin and it's clean and this sort of thing because of all these nasty arsenic chemicals that are in soot.
Absolutely, we didn't get there and didn't want to get up time. That could be an entire different topic. I just talked to Jennifer, who was a researcher from Canada. She made research on wipes, like how to clean your skin after fire.
Right.
One of the conclusions was probably doesn't help that much. It's probably not that bad, but for PAHs and stuff like that, because it gets absorbed to your skin so fast. When the soot hits your skin, it's basically absorbed before you can remove it, almost. Okay. During firefighting. So to keep out of the smoke entirely is probably good, because what I found really interesting was because firefighters have become during the recent years so good at wearing breathing protection, both particle masks but also SCBAs, that they didn't see any problems with inhalation. Reduced problems with inhalation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, but they saw after a fire that they didn't see. I didn't know about indicators about damages to the lungs, but they saw a lot of pHs or derivatives of whatever that turns into in the urine. So it was an indicator that it didn't come from the inhalation; it came from dermal exposure. So dermal exposure seems to be the hardest one to stop right now, and I'm actually wearing, which is pretty cool, an active carbon underwear now. Which is pretty bizarre, but it was part of the the chemical warfare, old product from Germany, many years. A Swedish company picked it up and made a firefighter version, where it's basically a thin piece of active carbon you have under your skin, and outside of that a particle barrier. So whatever pHs and small gases comes through, it's absorbed by the active carbon. But the only problem, of course, cost is one, but it's just you don't know where it's saturated. So if it's 50 fires, 100 fires, or 1,000 fires, it gradually the protection will get lower. But that's the only solution for dermal I've seen, besides trying to get out of the smoke, like being below the smoke layer, using ventilation, which is good for others, and so on. But it's a whole different topic, and we could probably talk about. But I think people like you have contributed to firefighters actually wearing their SCBAs better than 10 years ago. Because when I started fire service, which was about 20 years ago or 18 years ago, I stepped inside. I wore the same PPE, the same firefighter clothes, and SCBA without washing it for 2 years during my basic academy, because there was zero information on this being bad for your health. So it's come a long way since then. That's just 18 years ago or 20 years ago. That's been a massive improvement. David, I thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me.
It's a pleasure.